Life is suffering. That sentence is, for most people, the whole of what the Buddha taught, and it has sat in textbooks and on the backs of paperbacks and in the mouths of first-year lecturers for something like 150 years, and he did not say it. What he said was a word with no clean equivalent in English, and the word is dukkha, du-ku. The translators of the 1800s, working in a Europe already primed to hear that the East was gloomy, handed it to us as suffering, and that one decision has probably done more damage to him than any of his enemies ever managed. If you have read around the subject at all, you may already know the repair, because it is a good repair and it gets told often. The word comes from carts, so the story goes, from the hole at the center of a wheel, where an axle that sits badly in its socket makes the whole vehicle shudder and grind its way into town. It is an elegant explanation, and you will hear it in meditation halls and find it in serious books, and it is also most likely wrong. The people who have spent their working lives inside the grammar of these languages mostly take the word from somewhere plainer, from a root meaning standing badly, which is not agony and not the great wheel of human misery, but something smaller and far more familiar, a thing set down slightly off its base, which will not settle and cannot be got comfortable, however you shift it. It is the word for a life that does not quite sit right. That is what he built everything else on, and the reason it has lasted this long is that there is nobody alive who does not know the feeling. The man who found the word was called Siddhartha Gautama. Siddhartha Gautama. And nearly everything that arrives in your head when you hear the word Buddha is later decoration. The gold leaf, the closed eyes, the half smile, the enormous unbothered calm. Before any of that, he spent 6 years starving himself on purpose, and he described the result afterwards in the flattest voice imaginable. His ribs stood out like the rafters of a roofless barn. When he reached down to touch his stomach, he found he had taken hold of his spine instead. He was not a god and never claimed to be one, and he spent his whole life declining to say whether anything at all survives death. What he was, if you scrape the incense off him, is a diagnostician. He looked at people the way a physician looks at a patient who has come in complaining of something they cannot name. And he concluded that the nameless thing was real, that it had a cause, that the cause could be removed, and that there was a procedure for removing it. Then he said the part that never makes it onto the poster, which is that if you go looking for the person who is doing the suffering, you will not find anyone in there. No self, nothing sitting behind the eyes, nothing that holds still all the way from a boy asleep in his father's field to an old man lying down for the last time on a road outside a town nobody has heard of, which leaves a question that was put to him in one form or another for 45 years, and that I have never managed to decide whether he answered. If there is nobody home, who is it that gets free? And what would make a man who had concluded that get up before dawn for 4.5 decades and walk another 20 miles in the heat to go and find somebody to tell? All of it is here. Everything that mind worked out in 45 years on the road, and the handful of questions he was asked directly, over and over, and refused to answer until the day he died. None of which needs settling tonight. It is late, you are horizontal, and the questions that seem to demand something of you at 4 in the afternoon are much better company at this hour, when there is nothing to be done about any of them, and nowhere you are supposed to be. You do not have to follow all of this, and you are certainly not required to remember it. If you go under somewhere in the middle, that is not a lapse in concentration, it is more or less the design. So let your head go properly heavy into the pillow, and let your jaw come unstuck, because it is probably still holding something left over from the day. Your shoulders will come down on their own once you stop holding them up. There is a long night ahead of us, and no hurry anywhere in it. If work like this is worth having in the world, subscribing is most of what keeps it being made, and it costs you nothing but a moment of being briefly less horizontal. And one question to carry, if you want one. What is the thing you have been telling yourself you will deal with later, and roughly how long has later been going on? He was 29 years old, and it begins in a doorway, late at night, with two people asleep behind him who do not know that he is going. The room would have been warm and dark and smelling faintly of lamps recently put out, and the woman in it was called Yasodhara, Yusoduru, and the child beside her had been alive a matter of days. He did not wake them. According to the tradition, he stood there a while and looked, and then he turned around and went out through the courtyard and off the property, and he did not come back for the better part of a decade. You have almost certainly been told why. He went out riding, the story goes, and on 4 separate excursions he saw 4 things his father had spent his entire childhood keeping out of his sight. An old man folded over a stick, a man shaking with fever, a corpse being carried down to the burning ground, and last of all, a wanderer with a shaved head and a begging bowl who looked, in the middle of all that, strangely untroubled. 4 sights. The 4th one showed him the door. That story is in the canon, told at length and in loving detail, about a man who is not him. The text it belongs to is a discourse on the Buddhas who came before, and the young prince in it who rides out and meets the old man and the sick man, and the corpse is called Vipassi, and he is placed 91 aeons in the past, which is the tradition's way of saying that the number is not the point. The 4 sights are a template. They are what happens to any Buddha, the way certain things happen to any hero in any story anybody has ever told around a fire, and it was only centuries afterwards, in the fuller biographies written to fill in a life the oldest texts had left oddly bare, that somebody lifted them across and gave them to Gautama. What the oldest layer has him say about that night in his own voice is shorter and considerably colder. He describes himself going forth while still young, black-haired, in the prime of his life, and then he adds, without any softening at all, that his mother and father did not want him to go, and that they were weeping with tearful faces while he did it. There is no chariot ride in it, and no dawning revelation, only a healthy young man walking out of a house where people are crying and asking him not to. His own mother had been dead since the week he was born, so the woman weeping was the aunt who had raised him in her place, which means that by the time he reached the gate, he had made 2 women grieve on his way past. It is worth being accurate about what he was leaving, because the word prince has done a great deal of quiet work in this story. His people were a clan called the Sakyas, SRQs, and the historians who look hard at this mostly doubt they were a kingdom in any sense a European fairy tale would recognize. They looked like a land-holding clan on the northern rim of the plain, running their affairs through an assembly of leading families, with a chief who was chosen rather than crowned. His father was that chief, which makes the son something nearer to the heir of a powerful landowner than a prince with a throne waiting. The comfort, though, is real, and it is in the early texts rather than the decoration. He says himself that he was raised delicately, exceedingly delicately, that he had 3 houses for the 3 seasons, and that through the 4 months of the rains he stayed on the upper floor and did not come down. The word we translate as palace means something closer to a fine large house. It was not a fortress with locked gates keeping old age out of view. It was a rich man's home, and the man leaving it was giving up a great deal. When any of this happened, I cannot honestly tell you, and neither can anybody else. Textual scholars spent most of the last century walking the dates later and later, until the working estimate for his death came to rest around 24 centuries ago. Then a team digging beneath the temple that stands on the spot the tradition has always pointed to as his birthplace found the post holes of a wooden shrine with the hollow of an old tree at the center of it, and the charcoal they lifted out of that floor dated some 200 years earlier again. two kinds of evidence, pointing two different directions, and nobody has closed the distance between them. So when I say he was 29, what I mean is that the tradition says 29, and the tradition is the only witness in the room. The child had been given a name, and the name is the thing I keep going back to. In the oldest account, when word came that the boy had been born, what the father is remembered as saying is that a Rahu has been born, a fetter has arisen. So the boy was called Rahula, Rahulu, and the word does carry that sense of a tether, a shackle, the thing that holds you where you are. Scholars will point out fairly that this may be a story built backwards out of the name, since Rahu is also the demon in the old sky myths who swallows the moon, and a child born during a lunar eclipse might have got the name for no darker reason than the weather that night. That may well be right. But look at what the tradition then did with it. A tradition wanting to protect its founder had every chance to let that sentence quietly fall out of the recitation, and instead it kept it and copied it and chanted it aloud for centuries. The line in which the gentlest man it knew of received the news of his newborn son and described him as an obstruction. Nobody preserves a detail like that by accident. Somebody decided it mattered, and I have read the passage more times than I can count, and I still do not know what to do with it. Here is the charge against him, and it deserves to be put at full strength rather than in the tidied version. This is a man whose whole working life rests on the claim that grasping at things causes harm, and the first use he made of that insight was to inflict it on two people who were given no say. A woman who had given birth days earlier, in a world where a woman's entire standing ran through her husband, woke to find him gone. A boy grew up with a father who was a rumour in another province. If a man on your street did this tomorrow, the word for it would be desertion, and nothing that happened afterwards alters what it was on the night. The tradition's answer is that he came back, that what he brought back was worth more than what he took, and that both of them ended up inside the order he founded, which is true as far as it goes. Yasodhara became a nun. So did the aunt. The boy was ordained. But look at how the boy was ordained, because this is where it gets harder rather than easier. He returned to the town years later, no longer a young man in good clothes, and the child, 7 or so by then, and told at last who this visitor was sent out to ask him for his inheritance. He was the only son of the leading family. There was an estate to come. What he was handed instead was a shaved head and a bowl, and his father had him ordained where he stood. And then the old chief came to see his son. He had now watched that house emptied 3 times over, a son and then another son, and now the grandson, and what he said has come across 2,500 years without needing any help from a translator. Love for a child, he said, cuts through the skin, and through the skin into the flesh, and through the flesh down to the marrow. He asked that no child ever be ordained again without the consent of their parents. And the thing that stops me writing this man off, the thing I hold on to in this part of the story, is that he listened. He made the rule that day. It is still in the monastic code, 24 centuries later, because an angry old man came and told him he had not thought it through, and he agreed. You can make up your own mind about him, and I would rather you did, because a version of this man who arrives finished and beyond criticism is no use to anybody at 3 in the morning. His own tradition never entirely settled it either. It kept the weeping in the doorway. It kept the fetter. It kept the old man's complaint and the rule that came out of it. For 2,500 years, it has been carrying the evidence against its own founder from one generation to the next, and it has never once been tempted to lose the file. He went south on foot with a shaved head, no money and no particular destination, into a country crowded with men who had done the same thing and were all selling different ways out. Whatever it was he had left that house to find, it did not exist yet. He was going to have to make it, and the only material he had to hand was himself. The room around you has not changed at all since we started. The dark is the same dark. It is only the man in the doorway who has moved, and he is a good distance off now, walking south on an unlit road in the last hours of the night, which is a fine thing to be holding while you lie still and warm and going nowhere, because none of the walking is yours. The texts preserve a small argument about what he looked like in those years. Some people who saw him said the ascetic Gautama is black. Others said no, he is not black, he is brown. A third group said he is neither, he is golden-skinned, and the reason 3 sets of eyes could take in the same man and come away with 3 different answers is that his skin had stopped reporting a colour of its own and was giving back only whatever the sun and the dirt and the starving had put on it. He had not gone out looking for that. Nobody leaves a good house intending to end up as a thing that strangers disagree about at the roadside, and what he did first was entirely sensible. He went and found the best teacher available, a man called Alara Kalama, Ahla Ruh Kahlamu, who had a method, a reputation and a community around him, and he learned the whole of what the man had to teach so quickly that Alara made him an extraordinary offer. Come and lead this community with me, not as a student, as an equal. Take half of everything I have built. He said no and left. He left because of what the method did and did not do. It carried him into a stillness the ordinary mind never gets near, a depth of quiet that would take most people a lifetime to reach, and then, after some hours, it set him down again, and he was the same man in the same body with the same appointment ahead of him that he had walked in with. He said as much afterwards, plainly. This does not lead anywhere. It leads to a place, and then you come back. So he went further along the road and found a second teacher, Udaka Ramaputta, Udduku Ramuputta, whose method reached further still into a state so fine that the texts can only name it by what it is not, a condition that is neither perceiving nor quite the absence of perceiving. He mastered that as well at the same speed, and this time the offer was bigger. Not half, the whole thing. Udaka asked him to take the community and lead it, and stood down in front of him. He said no to that too. 2 schools, 2 masters, 2 offers of the highest position available to a man in that country, both refused before he was 30, and both for the same reason. The calm was real, and the calm ran out. He was not looking for a better mood. He was looking for the way out of a situation, and the situation was that everything he had, including himself, was going to be taken off him. Which is what sent him to the other method, the serious one, the one everybody agreed was the real work. And to understand why a sane and gifted man walked into 6 years of that, you have to stop reading it as madness and start reading it as engineering, because it had a theory behind it, and the theory was coherent. The working model, held by a great many intelligent people in that part of the world, was that the trouble with a human being is accumulated residue. Everything you have ever done across a run of lives too long to count has left a deposit in you, and it is the deposit that keeps dragging you back into another body and another round of the same, which gives you 2 jobs. You have to stop laying down anything new, and that means stillness, restraint, harmlessness, doing as close to nothing as a living creature can manage. And you have to destroy what is already in there, and that takes heat. Their ordinary word for spiritual practice was, at root, their word for burning. Austerity in that world was not self-hatred, and it was not theatre. It was a furnace. You put the body in, and you turned it up, and you burned off the debt. Stand in that world for a moment, and it stops looking strange. You are 29, you have walked out on everything you had, and every serious person you meet on that road agrees on the direction of travel. The body is the obstacle, the thing that keeps handing you back into the same trouble, and whatever is to be done about it is done by taking the body apart. He started with the breath. The practice was to stop it, to shut the mouth and close off the nose and hold, and then to keep holding well past the point at which holding is possible, and he later described what that does to a person with a precision that suggests some part of him was taking notes the entire time. There is a roaring in the ears, he says, like the noise a blacksmith's bellows makes when somebody is working it hard. There is a pain in the head, as though a strong man was slowly tightening a leather strap around it. There is something happening in the belly that feels the way it would feel if a butcher were opening you with a good knife, and a heat all through the body, like being held over a pit of coals by two men with a grip on either arm. Then he stopped eating, or very nearly. A handful at a time, he says, and he lists what was in the handful without any drama at all: bean soup, lentil soup, veg soup, pea soup, and then less than that. The body went. The knuckles of his spine came up in a row under the skin like beads threaded on a string. His backside wore down until the only thing he could think to compare it to was a camel's hoof. His eyes sank so far back into the skull that to look into them, he says, was like looking down a deep well and catching the glint of water a long way below. His scalp shriveled the way a green gourd shrivels after it has been cut and left out in the wind and the sun, and when he rubbed at his limbs to bring some feeling back into them, the hair came off in his hand because the roots had rotted. There is one more detail kept in a different account that I find harder to get past than any of the physical ones. During those years, the cowherds and grass cutters and the boys out gathering wood would come across him sitting there, and they would spit on him and urinate on him and throw dirt at him and push sticks into his ears. Not out of resentment of a holy man. He had simply stopped registering as a person and become a thing at the edge of the field that did not move when you poked it. It would be comfortable to file all of this as a wrong turn. 6 lost years belonging to a young man who did not yet know better, and that is more or less how the story usually gets told. It does not survive contact with the people who were doing the same thing in the same decade and did not stop. Somewhere within a few days' walk of him in those same years was a teacher we call Mahavira, whose followers are the Jains. Same country, same generation, same basic diagnosis of the human problem, and Mahavira did not quit. He went on, and the tradition he shaped is still standing. Several million people, an unbroken line of practice, and some of the most careful ethical thinking anyone anywhere has done about harm and the causing of it. At the far end of that practice sits a fast undertaken deliberately at the close of a life and carried all the way through. And it is not a museum piece. It happens. It gets argued about in Indian courtrooms in the present tense. So the objection to him here is not something I am inventing in order to be fair. It is a live position held by living people, and at full strength, it runs like this. From inside that worldview, 6 years is nothing. The debt is counted in lifetimes. A man who runs the discipline for 6 years gets within sight of the far end and then announces that the far end was a mistake, has not made a discovery. He has found a reason to eat. And everything mild and reasonable that follows, every sensible middle position, is simply what it looks like when a person builds a philosophy around the moment they gave up. I do not think that is right. But it has to be put at that strength, because the usual defense of him is feeble. The usual defense is that he was too wise to damage himself, which is not remotely what happened. What happened is that he damaged himself further than almost anybody, and he said so afterwards without embarrassment, that he did not believe there was a man alive who had gone past him in it. He did not stop because he could not stand it. He stopped because he had run the experiment out to the end of the equipment and got nothing back. And what he had actually established, though it would be a while before he could say it in those words, is that the thing he was trying to kill was not where he had been aiming. 6 years of dismantling a body had not laid a finger on the problem, because the problem had never been in the body. It was in whatever had been standing over that body the whole time, keeping score, taking readings, wanting the result. That part had never once gone hungry. Most tellings give these 6 years a sentence and move briskly onto the good part, and I think the briskness is a mistake, because everything he later says about not inflicting suffering on yourself on purpose was paid for here, in advance, by a man sitting in the dirt with his own hair coming away in his fingers. The least we can do is not walk past it. He was somewhere in the 6th year. He had proved something, though not the thing he had set out to prove, and he had no idea yet that what was going to turn him around was already in his possession and had been sitting there since he was a child, filed somewhere he had never once thought to look. Your own body, meanwhile, is doing none of this. It is warm, and it is fed, and it is horizontal, and the only thing being asked of it at the moment is nothing whatsoever. You might notice, if you feel like noticing anything, how much of it is being held on out of habit rather than need. The hands, the jaw again, the small muscles around the eyes that have been at work since you got up this morning and have never once been told they are allowed to stop. They can stop. He did the hard part a long time ago, and he did it wrong, and one of the stranger mercies in the whole of this story is that it means nobody has to do it again. There is a field being ploughed, and a good deal of activity around the ploughing, and every adult in the place is busy with it. A small child has been put down at the edge of the field in the shade of a rose apple tree, out of the sun and out of the way. Nothing then happens. Nobody comes for him. The afternoon carries on being an afternoon, and at some point, sitting there with nothing wanted of him and nothing to reach for, the boy drops without any effort at all into a state of complete ease, a gathered and unhurried happiness with no object anywhere inside it, and then a voice calls from somewhere, and it is finished, and he is a child at the edge of a field again. Nobody wrote down how old he was. What the oldest text says is only that his father was working, that he was sitting in the cool shade of a rose apple tree, and that from there he came into a condition the tradition calls jhana, ja-nuh, which is its word for attention that has stopped pulling at things and settled. The ploughing festival, the ceremony, the crowd, all of that is later filling in by people who found the original too bare. The original has a working father, a tree, some shade, and a child who was not doing anything. 20 years or so afterwards, sitting in the dirt in a body he had spent 6 years taking apart, that afternoon came back to him. And what he thought when it surfaced was not that it was a pleasant thing to remember. What he thought was a question: could that be the path? And then, arriving straight behind it, the sentence that turns his entire life around, which he puts to himself as a question, and which reads in every translation I have seen like a man startled by his own fear. Why am I afraid of that pleasure? To see what that cost him, you have to see what it was arguing with. 6 years of practice, and behind the 6 years an assumption he had picked up from everybody around him and never once put under a light. That pleasure is the enemy. Not certain pleasures, pleasure. The whole machine depends on it. If what keeps dragging a person back into the world is wanting, and wanting runs on the promise of feeling good, then anything that feels good is the trap operating exactly as designed, and the only honest response is to cut the supply at the source, which is the body, which is why he was sitting where he was sitting. The memory did not argue with any of that. It simply sat there being a counterexample. Whatever had happened to a small boy in the shade at the edge of a field had felt remarkably good, and it had not come from getting anything, or having anything, or wanting anything, and when it ended, it had left no appetite behind it at all. The rule had a hole in it. He had been running an experiment on his own body for 6 years on the authority of a rule with a hole in it. This is where the phrase middle way usually gets produced, and it is worth saying what it is not, because it has been softened into something almost useless. It does not mean everything in moderation, and he was not a man with any temperamental gift for moderation about anything. What he had arrived at is stranger and more exact, that gorging the body and starving the body are not opposite mistakes, but the same mistake pointed in two directions, since both of them are strategies for managing a single supply of pleasure, one trying to secure it and one trying to abolish it, and both taking for granted that there is only the one kind and that it is dangerous. The middle is not a point halfway along that line. It is what becomes available when you stop believing the line is the only geography there is. There was a practical step in between, and the texts keep it, which I like about them. Having decided he was no longer frightened of that particular happiness, he noticed that it was not going to be reachable by a body in the state his was in. The instrument had to work. So he ate, and the oldest account grants the moment no ceremony whatsoever. Suppose I were to take some solid food, some rice and porridge, and so I took some solid food, some rice and porridge. That is the whole of it in the earliest version, a man deciding to have a meal. The tradition could not leave it that bare, and I do not entirely blame it. Later, tellings give the food a giver, a village woman called Sujata, who came out to make an offering at a tree and found something sitting beneath it that she took for the spirit of the place and fed it, which is not history, but is too good an image to throw away. The first meal of the entire tradition handed over by somebody with completely the wrong idea about what she was looking at. 5 men were with him. They had been at it alongside him for years, on the understanding that he was the one most likely to break through, and that when he did, he would come back and tell them how it was done. They watched him take the food, and they packed up and went, and the reason they gave was preserved word for word, which tells you nobody involved was embarrassed by it. The ascetic Gautama has gone soft. He is living in luxury. He has abandoned the effort and slid back into abundance. Stay with where that leaves him, because it gets hurried past. He has no teacher, having walked out on the 2 best in the country. He has no method, having just concluded that the one he gave 6 years to does not work. He has no companions as of this afternoon. He has a ruined body, a reputation among serious people as a man who could not finish, and a hunch resting entirely on a childhood afternoon. And to arrive there, he had to do the thing that almost nobody does, which is to look at 6 years of accumulated cost and call it a wrong turn. Everything in us resists that. The longer a person has been paying for something, the more certain they become that it must be nearly ready to work, and the ordinary human response to 6 failed years is a 7th harder. He is one of the few people on record who looked at an investment that size and simply set it down. The 5 were not fools, and their objection is better than it first sounds. They were not quarrelling about diet. What they were watching, from where they stood, was a man using a good feeling as evidence. He had a pleasant memory. The memory suggested that being comfortable might be allowed. He acted on it, and the acting on it happened to involve stopping something agonizing and starting something nice. Their point, which is a real one, is that this is precisely what self-deception looks like from the inside. Nobody ever rationalizes their way into a harder practice. The insight that shows up just as you are about to let yourself off the hook always arrives dressed as insight. Make comfort your compass, and you have handed the navigation to the one instrument guaranteed to bring you home. It is the standing complaint against every version of trust your body, be gentle with yourself, listen to what feels right, and it is a fair complaint because a good deal of the time the person saying it is about to do the easier thing and would like some cover. What he had, and they did not, was a distinction, and the rest of his life is built on it. He is not claiming that comfort is the road. He is claiming that there is more than one kind of happiness and that they do not run on the same fuel. There is the sort that comes from acquiring something, which requires a supply, generates a debt, and puts you back down slightly worse off than it picked you up. And there is whatever had happened under that tree, which was not produced by getting anything, took nothing from anywhere, and left no hunger behind it when it stopped. The 5 could not see the difference because their system had no room for the difference. They held one category for pleasure, and its label was danger. He had just located a second category, had nothing yet to call it, could not demonstrate it to anybody, and possessed as evidence one thing that had happened to him in a field when he was too small to be given a job. You almost certainly have one of your own, not the memory of an event, which is a different species of thing and usually has other people in it. An afternoon in which nothing occurred, lying on a floor somewhere with the sun coming across the boards. A back seat on a long drive, a window, countryside going past that you were not looking at. Grass in the middle of a day with the whole of a summer still in front of you. Nothing achieved in it, nothing gained. No reason on earth for it to have lasted when so much that mattered far more has gone. It stayed because of what it was like rather than because of anything in it. And if you go and turn it over now, what you are actually remembering is the absence of wanting anything. That is the material he worked with. Not a doctrine, not a technique, nothing handed to him by either of the 2 great teachers he outgrew, just an ordinary afternoon of no significance whatsoever that he had been carrying for 20 years without knowing it was in his pocket, and which turned out to be the only evidence he owned that the entire world's theory of happiness had something wrong with it. And it is not far off where you are heading in a few minutes, which I find strange every time I come back to it. What he described is a settling, an attention that gives up reaching, a contentment with nothing in it that anybody put there. What is going to happen to you shortly, if it has not begun already, is that the day lets go of its grip, the arguing stops, and something takes over that you are not the one running. Not the same thing, and he would say so first, since what he found took him years to reach on purpose, and what is coming for you will arrive whether you approve of it or not. But they are relatives. You will feel all of this go soft and slightly distant in a minute, and that is not you losing the thread. That is the thread. He got there from a field on an afternoon, and there is no good reason you cannot get there from a bed at night. An army turns up in some versions of that night. A demon called Mahru, comes up out of the dark with a host at his back, and the weapons they throw turn to flowers in the air before they land, and when that fails, he sends his daughters, and when that fails, he demands to know by what authority this man presumes to sit where he is sitting. And the answer is that the man lowers his right hand and touches the ground and calls the earth itself as his witness, and the earth answers on his behalf. You can find that scene carved on walls from Sri Lanka to Japan. None of it is in the oldest accounts, and I have some sympathy with whoever added it, because the difficulty they faced is a real one. What the earliest texts describe cannot be carved. There is no opponent in it. There is nothing for an artist to put on the other side of the stone. So the tradition supplied an enemy and gave the man something to defeat, because a man sitting still and paying attention is not an image that survives being made into a monument. What the earliest texts describe is a man who has eaten properly for the first time in years, sitting down under a tree beside a river at nightfall and attending to his own breathing. Then 3 things across the 3 watches of that night, told in a strange flat sequence. In the first, he says, he remembered his previous lives, one and then another, and then hundreds, and then a span of them too long to hold, with the names and the food and the pleasure and the pain of each. In the second, he saw other beings doing the same thing, going out and coming back, rising and falling according to what they had done. And in the third, he found the thing underneath all of it, the mechanism that keeps the whole apparatus turning, and he took it apart, and the formula the texts use is that ignorance was banished, and knowledge arose, darkness was banished and light arose, and it says, almost in passing, that this happened as the dawn came up. He stayed there for some weeks afterwards, doing nothing in particular, and then comes the part of the story that almost nobody is told, which is that he decided not to say a word of it to anybody. The reasoning is preserved, and it is worth hearing in something close to his own order. What he had found was deep, he says, hard to see, hard to make out, peaceful and fine, and not reachable by argument, and people are in love with their attachments and would not follow him into it. If I taught this, he says, others would not understand me. And then the clause that stops me every time, because it is not lofty at all, and it is the most human sentence in the whole account, that would be wearying and troublesome for me. That is the reason. Not that they did not deserve it, not that the world was unworthy. It would be exhausting, and it would be a nuisance, and he had just spent 13 years getting here, and the thought of the next 45 explaining it to people who would not get it was more than he could face. The text says his mind inclined to inaction, which is the phrasing of a man leaning back in a chair, and he even composed a short verse about it, to the effect that there was no point, since nobody living in wanting and dislike was going to see it anyway. What changed his mind in the telling is that one of the high gods came down and knelt in front of him and made an argument. The god's first thought on realizing what was about to happen is given as a kind of shout. The world will be lost, the world will perish. And then the plea itself, which is not that everybody will understand, but that some will, that there are beings out there with only a little dust in their eyes who are going to waste for want of hearing this, and the image that finally moves him is one of the loveliest in the literature, and it is not optimistic. He looks out across the world and sees people as lotuses in a pond. Some of them are down under the water and will live and die down there without ever coming up. Some have reached the surface and are resting level with it, and a few have come up clear of the water altogether and stand in the air with the water not even wetting them. That is his estimate of the audience. Not everyone, a minority, already most of the way up on their own, who might be reached. On the strength of that, he says the doors to the deathless are open and gets up. Then he has to decide who to tell, and this is the part that has the taste of real life about it, because his first two thoughts are the two men who taught him, the ones whose offers he turned down, both of whom he still rates as the finest minds he has met. He wants to go to the first one. He is told the man died 7 days ago. He turns to the second. That one died the previous night, missed by a night, after 13 years, and what he says about it is that it is a great loss that they would have understood this quickly, which leaves the 5. He learns they are living in a deer park outside Benares, roughly 150 miles away, and he walks it on foot in the heat, having been upright for only a few weeks. The road he walked was not empty of competition. That corner of the world at that moment was thick with teachers, and their positions were not timid. One of them held that nothing anybody does carries any moral weight whatsoever, that a man could put every living thing on earth to the sword, and no evil would attach to him. Another held that a person is nothing but earth and water and fire and air, that at death each part goes back to its own kind, and the rest is talk, and that the wise and the foolish end identically. Another taught that everything is fixed in advance, that no effort makes any difference to anything, that every being simply runs out its allotted span the way a ball of string unwinds when you throw it and stops when it reaches the end. And it was a follower of that last school who became the first person on earth to be told. On the road, he met a wandering ascetic called Upaku, who looked at him and said that his features were clear and his complexion bright, and asked who his teacher was and whose teaching he followed. He answered that he had no teacher, that there was nobody like him, that he was the one who had woken up. Upaka heard this out. Then he said, "May it be so, friend," and shook his head and took a side road and went off in the other direction. Nothing more is heard of Upaka for a long time. The first man ever to receive it shrugged and walked away, and it is difficult to blame him, given that his own school held that nothing anyone said or did to anyone could alter the outcome of anything. The 5 saw him coming across the park and made a pact about it. They would not stand up. They would not go out to meet him or take his bowl and robe from him the way you would for a teacher. A seat could be put out, and that was as far as it would go. And then he came close enough that the pact collapsed, and one of them was taking the bowl, and another was putting out a seat, and another had gone for water for his feet, and none of them appears to have been able to explain afterwards what happened. They still called him by his name and addressed him as an equal, and he stopped them and told them not to, which is a strange, stiff, slightly imperious moment that I am glad the tradition kept. They pushed back reasonably that when he had been genuinely trying, he had achieved nothing, so what exactly was he claiming now? And what turned them was not an argument. He asked them a question. "Have I ever spoken to you like this before?" And they thought about it and said no, and sat down. Here is the objection, and it does not come from his enemies, it comes from him. He said the thing was not reachable by reasoning and had to be undergone. If that is true, then words can only ever gesture at it, and what you get downstream of the gesture is people arguing about the gesture, and the record does not obviously refute him. Within a century of his death, his community was splitting over procedure. Within a few centuries, there were schools with genuinely incompatible accounts of what he had meant. There are traditions alive today, all of them tracing back to that afternoon in the deer park, that would each say the others have fundamentally misunderstood the man. What travelled was never the thing he had. What travelled was a description, and then commentary on the description, and then institutions built on the commentary, and by the time it reaches a room like yours, it has been through more hands than anybody can count. I do not think the response to that is to say he was right to teach and leave it there. The more interesting response is that he seems to have known all of it. Nothing in the account suggests he expected the transmission to work. He looked at the pond and saw most of the flowers underwater. What he made was not a bet on humanity, it was an estimate about a fraction, and he decided that the fraction was worth the next 45 years of walking. Which leaves the question I would rather hand to you than answer. Suppose there is something you are sure of, and you are equally sure that almost nobody will take it properly, and that saying it will cost you every remaining year you have. The reason he nearly kept quiet was not cowardice or contempt. It was that it would be wearying and troublesome, and he had already done the hard part and could have simply sat there for the rest of his life, having been right. Most of the good things that never get done are not stopped by anything grander than that. He sat down in front of 5 men in a deer park with the afternoon going yellow around them, and he began. What he said in the next hour is the thing that has been handed down and argued over ever since, and it has kept for 2,500 years, so it will certainly keep until morning if you go under before he is finished. And if you are still here, it starts now. The first thing out of his mouth was not about suffering, it was a defense. Before he says anything else, he tells them that there are 2 ways of going at this that do not work, that handing yourself over to whatever feels good is coarse and gets nobody anywhere, and that grinding yourself down is painful and gets nobody anywhere either, and that he has found the road that runs between them. Which is, given who was sitting in front of him, not a philosophical preamble. It is an answer to a charge. These were the men who had watched him take a bowl of food and concluded he had lost his nerve, and the opening words of the entire tradition, the first public sentence anybody ever spoke on this subject, are a man telling 5 former colleagues that they had him wrong. Then he gets to the word, and the way he opens it out is not abstract in the least. It is a list of situations: being born, getting old, getting ill, dying. Then two that have nothing to do with the body: being stuck with what you do not want and being separated from what you do. Then the flattest one on the list: not getting what you are after. And then a last item of a completely different order, which reads in most renderings like a door left standing open at the end of a corridor, to the effect that, in short, the whole bundle of things a person is made of, held onto, is this. The tradition later took that word apart into three kinds, and it is worth walking them in order because only one of them is the discovery. The first is the one nobody needs explained: a tooth, a phone ringing at an hour when phones do not ring, the particular texture of a Tuesday 6 weeks after a funeral, when the food has stopped arriving and everyone has gone back to work and you are supposed by now to be fine. If that were the whole of what he meant, he would be saying something true and entirely unremarkable that every culture in human history has said, and the word would not have been worth arguing about for 2,500 years. The second is stranger, because it is not about bad things at all. It is about good ones, and about the fact that they run on a timer, and that some part of you can hear the timer while the good thing is still happening. You have had this at a table with people you love, at the point in the evening where it is going well and nobody has left yet, and you become aware, without having asked to be, that this will end, that coats will be found, that this exact arrangement of these people in this room is not going to occur again. Nothing has gone wrong. The evening is a success. And there is a thin, cold thread running through the middle of it that has nothing to do with the evening and everything to do with the fact that you are holding something which is already on its way out. And then there is the third, which is what he was actually pointing at, and which is why the word does not translate. It is not pain, and it is not loss. It is the continuous low cost of keeping anything going. Everything you have has to be held up. Your body has to be held up several times a day and does not stay held. Your work has to be. The people you love have to be, and so does the version of you that they are dealing with, and so does the flat and the car and the ongoing project of being someone who is broadly all right. None of it stands unassisted. Stop holding any of it, and it begins coming apart at a speed that would surprise you, and the holding is never completed, and there is no evening on which the holding is finished, and may be set down for good. That is the sense in which a thing can be off its base with absolutely nothing wrong with it. It is not that your life is bad. It is that your life will not stay upright unattended, and some part of you is aware of the effort at every moment, and the awareness is so constant that it reads as nothing in particular, which is why it tends to become audible at about this hour, when everything else has finally stopped making noise. So he is not compiling a list of unpleasant things. He is pointing at three different textures, and the first is common knowledge, and the second is common knowledge to anyone paying attention, and only the third is a claim about the structure of having anything at all, which is why you cannot argue with it by producing a good day. It was never about whether the day was good. Here is what almost everybody misses. Of the four things he laid out in that park, the first is comfortably the least interesting, and it is the only one anyone ever quotes. Saying that life is unsatisfactory is not a daring position. Half the poets who have ever lived arrived there before lunch. What is daring, and what practically nobody repeats, is the third item, which is that this condition has an end. Not that it can be borne with dignity, not that it can be reframed into something more bearable, that the hum can stop permanently in a living person, and that he had done it and knew the route, and was about to give the route to 5 men in a deer park. That is an extraordinary claim, the sort you would want considerable evidence for. And the peculiar history of this material in the West is that the extraordinary claim got quietly mislaid, and the ordinary one got printed on everything. The 4-part shape he used was not, as far as anyone can tell, his invention. It is the shape of a diagnosis, and it is the shape Indian medicine of the period worked in, and scholars have gone back and forth for a long time about which direction the borrowing ran. What matters to a person lying in the dark is what the shape rules out. Nobody arranges a lament like that. A lament stops at the first item. The serious objection to all of it comes from somebody who admired it, which makes it far harder to put down than hostility would be. Friedrich Nietzsche, reckoned Buddhism 100 times more realistic than the Christianity he was raised inside, and said so in print. He called it the only genuinely positive religion history had produced. He praised it for meeting its problems coolly, without having to invent sin in order to account for pain, and he observed, with something close to affection, that Buddhism promises nothing and delivers, whereas Christianity promises everything and does not. Having said all that, he filed it under decline. His argument is not that the diagnosis is inaccurate. He concedes the diagnosis. His argument is about who tends to make it and when. This kind of thinking shows up, he thought, at a specific point in the life of a civilization, after centuries of philosophy have worn everybody's edges down, among mild and gentle and over-considered people who have grown unusually sensitive to discomfort and are running low on appetite. A creature with vitality in it does not notice the hum because it is busy wanting things and making things and failing at things and going again, and the wanting is not a fault in the machine, the wanting is the machine running. The ability to sit still and register the fine grain of dissatisfaction in absolutely everything is not, on this reading, a higher faculty. It is what a nervous system does once it has nothing left to push against. The clarity is real. The clarity is also a symptom. And what he goes after hardest is the goal. Make the ending of suffering the highest thing a life can be for, and you have already ruled that the most important fact about being alive is that it hurts, which is the ruling a tired animal makes. I have never got this one to resolve, and I have had a long time to try. Everything in that objection could be true of the people who take this teaching up, and the diagnosis would still be standing because a tired person can be right, and the fact that you only heard the hum once you stopped moving does not mean it was not running while you moved. And yet I do not think he is merely being unfair, because I have met the thing he is describing, the calm that is really only depletion wearing a better word for itself, and so in all likelihood have you. What I can say is that the man in the deer park was not depleted, whatever else he was. He had been depleted thoroughly and had come out the far side of it and had then walked 150 miles in the heat to have this particular conversation, which is not the conduct of someone who has finished wanting things. Whether that settles the argument I honestly could not tell you. He had also said that afternoon, what causes the whole condition, and his answer is the part that gets under people's skin, because it does not blame the world. The room you are in has almost nothing in it now, and that emptiness is the condition under which any of this becomes audible at all. In daylight, the hum is completely covered. There is traffic, and there is a screen, and there is the next thing, and the next thing is always available and does an excellent job. It is only in a dark room with nothing scheduled that you get to hear what has been running underneath since you opened your eyes this morning. Which is not a bad thing to have learned about your own life. It is information rather than an accusation, and it is not asking anything of you tonight. Nothing in this room needs holding up. The walls are managing without you. Whatever it is you have been keeping upright all day can stand there unattended for a few hours, and nobody is coming to inspect it, and you can let go of the entire arrangement now and see what it does. There is a hill outside a town called Gaia, and on it one evening 1,000 men who had spent their whole adult lives tending fires. They were ascetics of an old kind, matted-haired, and the fire was the practice, keeping it, feeding it, making offerings into it, understanding the entire business of being alive as a transaction conducted through flame. 3 brothers ran the order between them, 500 followers to the eldest and 300 and 200 to the others, and all 1,000 of them had recently come over, which means that on that hillside sat the largest audience he had ever spoken to, and it was made up from front to back of professionals. What he told them was that everything is on fire, not as a figure of speech. He goes through it methodically, and the method is where the whole thing lives. The eye is burning, he says. Then, before anybody can settle comfortably into the idea that the problem is the eye, he adds that what the eye sees is burning as well, and the seeing is burning, and the contact between them is burning, and whatever you feel as a result of that contact, whether it is pleasant or unpleasant or neither, is also burning. Then the ear, then the nose and the tongue and the skin, then the mind, and every single thing the mind lays hold of. Burning with what? He asks, and gives the answer himself. With wanting, with aversion, with not seeing straight, and with birth and aging and death and grief and pain and despair. Consider what that does to a room full of fire specialists. These were men who knew about fire at the practical end, who had built their lives around the correct handling of it. And they are being informed by a man sitting on the grass that the fire they should have been minding was never in the pit. The thing he named as the cause, in that first talk in the deer park and in every version afterwards, usually reaches English as desire, which is far too soft. The word is tanha, tunha, and what it means is thirst. Not preference, not appetite in the civilized sense of somebody looking down a menu. Thirst, the physical article, the kind that arrives in the throat of a person who has been walking since morning and cannot be talked out of it. And the English word is not a translation so much as a relative. Our thirst and his thirst come down from the same ancient root, which meant dry. That distinction does more work than it appears to. A desire is something you have. A thirst is something that has you. Nobody decides to become thirsty, and nobody argues themselves out of it. And while it is running, the world quietly rearranges itself around water without asking anybody's permission. Which is why reading this as a moral failing goes wrong at the first step. He is not saying that wanting things makes you a bad person. He is describing a mechanism in the voice of a man describing a mechanism, and the mechanism is indifferent to your opinion of it. Notice, too, where he puts it, because this is the part that makes people bristle. The obvious account of why life will not sit right is that the world is badly arranged. There is not enough of it. It is unfairly handed out. It is far too short, and nobody consented to any of the terms. That account is available and largely accurate, and he declines to use it. He puts the cause inside the person doing the complaining, which is either the most useful move anyone has ever made or an outrageous piece of blaming the afflicted, depending on your mood and the hour. What can be said for it is that it is the only end of the problem you have any access to. Nobody has ever repaired the world. People do occasionally get somewhere with the other thing. There is an experiment you have run several hundred times and never once written up. You want something, you get it, and the relief is real and also brief, and you can very nearly time it. A few days for a large item, an afternoon for a middling one, about 4 minutes for the small ones. Then the machinery resets and fastens onto the next thing with no memory whatsoever of having been here before, and the next thing is now what stands between you and being all right. Which tells you the one thing the object itself will never tell you, which is that it was never the object. If the thirst were about the water would work. It works for roughly as long as swallowing takes. He broke the thirst into 3, and the first 2 are what you would expect. The first is thirst for the pleasant, which is food and sex and comfort, and the good chair, and the next episode, and all the small chemical arrivals that punctuate a day, and it is the one everybody assumes the entire teaching is about, which is how the entire teaching got mistaken for a warning against enjoying yourself. The second is the thirst to be, to exist, to continue, to go on being somebody, to be regarded in a particular way, to have your name last a while, to still be here next year and the year after that. It runs far deeper than the first and is much harder to catch because it does not present itself as wanting. It presents itself as being alive. And this is precisely where the strongest objection to him arrives, so it may as well arrive now rather than politely at the end. Every decent thing any human being has ever made was made by somebody who could not let something go. The parent sitting up at 4 in the morning with a child running a temperature is not working from serenity. They are working from a fierce, unreasonable, entirely non-negotiable attachment, and if they had less of it, the child would be worse off. The person who gives 30 years to a single problem is thirsty. Cathedrals, vaccines, the long patient work of raising anybody at all. The whole of it runs on a refusal to be at peace with how things currently stand. Take the thirst out and you do not get a serene person. You get somebody to whom nothing matters, and there is a name for that condition, and it is not liberation. Ask anyone who has been through the flat grey middle of a depression whether losing the ability to want things felt like freedom. It gets described, without exception, as the worst thing that ever happened to them. And there is a harder version still, which is that the tradition looks to have half conceded the point, because its institutional answer was to leave. Do not marry, do not have children, do not build. Which reads less like a way of living without thirst than an arrangement for removing the occasions of it. Which brings us to the third one, and the third one is why I do not think that objection lands where it appears to. The third thirst is for not being, for the ending of it. Not suicide usually, and not despair exactly, but the quieter and far more common thing, the wish to be switched off, to not have to be a person again tomorrow, to have the whole apparatus of being somebody, with a name and a history and a set of obligations and a face that other people hold expectations about, simply discontinued. You know this one. It has a specific hour and a particular flavor, and most people who feel it would be embarrassed to call it a wish to die, because it is not that. It is a wish for the absence of the requirement. And what he says about it is the strangest thing in this whole section of the teaching, which is that this is the same engine. Not the opposite of craving, but craving running backwards. The wish to stop existing is manufactured by exactly the machinery that manufactures the wish for more, and it feels different only because of the direction it is pointed in. Sit with that, and the objection changes shape. The cathedral builder and the person who cannot get out of bed are not, on this reading, at opposite ends of a scale with the calm man somewhere in the middle. They are the same process at different settings, and what he is proposing is not a lower setting, which is what everybody assumes. It is switching the process off, which is a different operation entirely from wanting less, and which leaves wide open the question of what a person does afterwards. The tradition does have an answer to that, and it is more level-headed than I expected when I first met it. A visitor once put the logical version of the problem to one of the senior monks. If the aim is the ending of desire, then you require desire in order to get there, so the thing eats itself. And the monk asked him whether he had wanted to come to this park today. He had. And now that you are here, where has that wanting gone? And the visitor saw it. Wanting to reach a place is genuine wanting. It does not survive arrival, and nothing has to be put in its place afterwards. Which is tidy, and I think it is correct as far as it reaches, and I notice that it answers the logical form of the objection without laying a finger on the human one. Because the human objection was never that the philosophy is inconsistent. It was that a life with nothing gripped in it might not be recognizable as a life. The most honest thing I can tell you is that the distinction he is drawing between wanting something and being unable to be all right without it is real, and that I can see it perfectly clearly in other people and very poorly in myself, and that most of the people I have watched being confident about which side of it they were standing on turned out to be wrong. There is one small piece of evidence available to you at this exact moment, if you want it. At some point today, your hand went and got your phone before you had decided anything, not after a decision, before one. You did not sit up and weigh whether this was a good moment. The arm went, and a reason arrived afterwards to account for the arm, and the reason was convincing and had nothing whatever to do with what actually happened. That is the entire mechanism in miniature, running on something that does not matter, and it is performing the identical trick on the things that do. But not at the moment. That is the piece worth having before you go under, and it is the only evidence anybody has ever had that this is not a permanent feature of being human. Right now, lying still in the dark with nothing to reach for and nowhere to be got to, the machinery is not running. There is nothing you are currently trying to obtain. There is nothing missing from this room that would improve it. Your hands are not going anywhere. Whatever you have been thirsty for since about 7 this morning is not being wanted just now, and you did not have to fight it, and you did not have to give anything up, and it stopped by itself the moment you stopped. He would say, that is not nothing. He would say, you have just been shown, on a small scale and entirely by accident, that the fire has to be fed, and that when nobody feeds it, it goes out. Let it go out. Sona Esochna was born rich, and the texts say the soles of his feet had fine hair growing on them because he had never in his life walked anywhere he could be carried to. He ordained anyway, and he took up the walking practice, which is exactly what it sounds like, a marked strip of ground paced slowly end to end with the attention kept on the pacing for as long as a person can bear it. Sona could bear it longer than anybody. He walked that strip until the skin came off the soles, and then he kept walking, and the account says the path he was using came to look like the floor of a slaughterhouse. And nothing happened. That is the part that matters. He was by common consent among the most determined men in the order. He had done considerably more than anyone had asked of him, and he had arrived precisely nowhere, and sitting there at the end of it, he reached an entirely reasonable conclusion. My family has money, he thought. I could go home, live decently, do some good with what I have, and stop failing at this. What he got instead was a visitor who did not tell him to try harder, and did not tell him to have faith, and asked him about the lute. You played before? Yes. And when the strings were wound too tight, was the instrument any good? No. And slack? No good either. And when they were neither tight nor slack, but sitting at the pitch that suited them? Then, Sona said, it played. Too much force produces agitation. Too little produces drift. Find the pitch. What lifts that above a piece of folk wisdom about balance is the situation it is answering. Sona's trouble was not laziness, and what he is being handed is not a recommendation to relax. His trouble was that he was applying maximum force to a lock that does not open under force, and he had no way of discovering this because every other lock in his life had opened under force. He had been a man who got what he went after. And here was the one thing that recedes at exactly the speed you pursue it. That is a real paradox, and it does not soften on inspection. What is wanted is a mind that has stopped clutching. The only tool most people own is clutching. So the instrument you would automatically reach for is the very thing you are trying to set down, and the harder you work it, the further off the result travels, and from inside the circle there is no obvious way out. His answer is the fourth of the 4 things he laid out that first afternoon, and it is the only one shaped like instructions, and it is by a long way the least quoted. Everybody can produce the diagnosis. Hardly anybody can produce the prescription, which is a peculiar situation for a body of thought that presents itself as a course of treatment. It comes in 8 parts, and the first thing to say about them is that they are not steps. You do not finish one and move along. They are not ranked, there is no order they are meant to be taken in, and the tradition draws the thing as a wheel rather than a staircase for exactly that reason. The word attached to each one usually reaches English as right, which fits badly because it turns the whole arrangement into a moral scorecard. The sense is nearer to properly set, the way a bone is set right, or fitted, the way a joint is fitted, or, given where this chapter started, in tune. Not right as against wicked, right as against out of true. And they fall into 3 groups, which is how I would rather hand them over, because 8 of anything at this hour is a list, and a list is the one form this material cannot survive. The first group is about how you see, what you take the situation to actually be, and what you are pointed at. That comes before conduct and before practice, because somebody who believes at the bottom of themselves that the next acquisition will settle things is going to behave accordingly, whatever they have agreed to in principle. The second is about how you live, what you say, what you do, and what you do for money. The third is about how you handle attention, the quality of the effort, which is where Sona was stuck. The practice of noticing what is actually happening rather than the running commentary about it, and the deliberate gathering of a scattered mind into one place. The arrangement of those 3 is the part I find genuinely clever, and it is nearly always explained wrongly. The middle group looks like the moral section and gets read as the moral section, and the usual account is that you have to be good in order to deserve the results. That is not the argument. The argument is mechanical, and if you have ever tried to sit quietly with something on your conscience, you already know it from the inside. A mind running a cover story cannot go quiet. It has a job. Some portion of it is permanently employed keeping 2 sets of books, checking what was said to whom, rehearsing the version, watching for the seam to open. That is not a poetic way of describing guilt. It is a genuine load, drawing on genuine attention, and it does not switch off when you lie down and close your eyes. It gets louder because everything that was covering it has just been taken away, so the reason not lying appears on a list about meditation has nothing to do with deserving anything. You cannot settle a mind that is managing a discrepancy. The ethics are not the entry fee. They are the maintenance schedule for the instrument. There is one detail in that middle group worth stopping on because it is more specific than people expect. Livelihood is on the list, and the tradition names actual trades to stay out of: weapons, human beings, flesh, intoxicants, poison. That list is 2,500 years old and has needed remarkably little revision. What is behind it is something that tends to get lost when ethics is discussed as a matter of individual decisions, which is that what you do for 8 hours a day is not a series of decisions. It is a shape you are pressed into 5 days a week, with or without your consent. The serious objection came from inside his own community, and it is a better objection than the usual telling allows. Someone there argued that the discipline ought to be compulsory and hard, and the same for everyone. Live in the forest, permanently. Beg for every meal. Wear what you find discarded. Sleep at the foot of a tree. Never touch meat or fish. And the case for that is not fanaticism, it is administration. And anybody who has ever run anything will recognize it immediately. A standard each person calibrates for themselves is not a standard. Tell 1,000 people to find their own right pitch, and you will get 1,000 pitches, and they will not scatter evenly. They will drift as one body in a single direction, because the faculty doing the calibrating is the faculty the entire system exists to correct. Every discipline that has held together across time held together because somebody else set the bar, and it was not open for discussion. Make rigor optional, and you have not created freedom. You have created a slow leak. He refused it. He permitted every one of those practices, let anyone take them up who wanted to, and declined to make a single one compulsory. And that refusal is a large part of why this tradition is now as various and as loose and as internally argumentative as it is. I do not think he is obviously right, and I notice that the tradition hedged. Sona is told to find his own pitch, and Sona is also living inside a code of several hundred rules he did not write and cannot adjust. The calibration is personal, the container is not, which is a more honest position than either side of the argument produces on its own, and it does mean that the version of this teaching most people meet, with the container removed entirely, is being asked to carry a weight it was never built to carry by itself, which is roughly my complaint about how this material travels. 8 parts will fit on a poster. They have numbers. They can be learned in an afternoon and produced fluently at dinner, and the fluency is close to worthless, and I say that as somebody who could recite the whole set for years before noticing that the middle group was a piece of engineering rather than a code of conduct. Anything you can say smoothly is something you have probably stopped looking at, and you are running the experiment yourself at this moment, whether or not you signed up for it. Sleep is the one version of this that everybody has lived through, which is why I keep coming back to it. It is a good state, it arrives under its own power, and it withdraws at precisely the rate you go after it. Anyone who has lain awake at 3 in the morning deciding to fall asleep now knows the mechanism intimately. The trying is what is keeping you up. The irritation at the trying is worse than the trying. And there is no maneuver available, because every maneuver is more of the thing causing it. There is only the one move, and Sona was given it on a strip of ground with his feet in ruins. Take the tension off the string, not slacken into nothing, because that fails too, and lying there resentfully waiting for sleep to arrive is its own variety of effort. Just let the pull come off, and let whatever wants to happen find its own speed. You will have noticed, if you are still with me, that all of this has moved a little further off in the last minute or so, and that the thread takes more holding than it did, and that the holding is beginning to feel like work. That is the tension coming off the string. Do not correct it. Going under is not something anybody does. It is what occurs the moment you finally stop doing, and it is about to be demonstrated on you at no cost at all by an instrument that has been waiting since this morning for you to take your hands off it. A Greek king once asked a monk his name, and the monk answered that he was called Nagasena, Nahgusenu, but that no person of that name was to be found anywhere. The king took this badly, and his objection was a good one. He ruled a kingdom left over from Alexander's march east. He had clearly been to some serious schools, and he came back immediately with the obvious problem. If there is no Nagasena, then who receives your robes and your food? Who keeps the training rules? Who is talking to me at this moment? And if somebody were to kill you, there would be no murder, since there would be nobody there to kill. So the monk asked him how he had travelled here. By chariot. Then let us look at this chariot, he said. Is the pole the chariot? No. The axle? No. The wheels, the frame, the yoke, the reins, the goad? No to all of them. Are all of them taken together the chariot? The king said no. Is there a chariot standing somewhere apart from them? The king said no again, and then observed dryly that by his own answers he appeared to have arrived in nothing whatsoever, and the monk told him he had not spoken falsely. Chariot is the word we use when those parts are assembled in a particular way. It is a perfectly good word, and it will get you across a city. It simply does not name a further object sitting behind the parts and waiting to be discovered. That exchange is the most famous demonstration in the tradition, and it is also late, set down perhaps 3 centuries after the man himself, which I mention because the earlier version is better and hardly anybody knows it. In the older text, the argument is made by one of the nuns to a demon who has come to unsettle her by demanding to know who made her. Why do you assume there is a being here at all? She says. This is a heap of processes, and no being is found in it. Just as, where the parts are assembled, we say chariot, so where these processes are running, we say a person. All of it goes back to something he said early, in front of those same 5 men in the same deer park, only days after the first talk. And the second thing he ever taught in public is far stranger than the first. And what makes it strange is that it arrives as an argument rather than as a revelation. It runs like this: take the body. If the body were genuinely the self, then it would do as it was told, and you would be able to say, let my body be this way, let it not be that way. You cannot. It ages on a timetable you did not set, sickens without consulting you, and will stop one day at an hour you will not be asked about. A thing that does whatever it does, regardless of instruction, is an odd candidate for what you most fundamentally are. Then he runs the same test on everything else. He divides the whole of a person into 5, and the list matters because it is meant to be exhaustive. There is the body. There is the raw tone of experience, the pleasant or unpleasant or neutral quality that arrives before you have had a thought about it. There is recognition, the sorting machinery that turns a shape into a known object and puts a name on it. There is the entire department of impulse and habit and intention, everything in you that leans and reaches and decides. And there is awareness itself, the bare fact of anything being lit up at all. That is the inventory. And the invitation attached to it is not to believe anything. The invitation is to go down the list looking for the owner. Which is why calling this a doctrine of no self goes wrong at the first step. It is not a doctrine. It is a search. And what is remarkable about it is the result. What he is not saying, and this gets muddled constantly, is that you do not exist. There is plainly something here reading a situation and getting tired and holding opinions. The claim is about what kind of thing it is, and the best handle I have found for that is music. A melody is entirely real. You can recognize one, be moved by one, fail to get one out of your head for a week, and it is nowhere at any single instant, because at any instant there is only a note, and a note is not a melody. It is a pattern in time and nothing besides, and if you stop the music and go looking inside the frozen chord for the tune, you will not find it, and the not finding it tells you nothing about whether the tune was real. You are not a note, you are a melody. And the question people ask when they go looking for themselves, which is where is the real me underneath all this change, is the question of somebody who has paused the recording and is examining one chord for the song. You can run the search yourself, and this hour suits it better than most, because most of the ordinary noise has already gone. Start with the body, which is easy. There is a weight of you on the bed, warm, doing several things without being asked. Clearly yours in some sense, much less clearly you, given that you had a different one at 9 years old and will have another in 20 years, and nobody believes they became somebody else in the meantime. Then the feeling tone. There is a quality to how you are just now, low and steady, and it moves. Half an hour ago it was different, and it will be different again, and if that is you, then you have been several people since dinner. Then thought. Catch the last one that arrived. You did not commission it. It turned up fully assembled from somewhere you have no access to, and if you doubt that, try to predict the next one. And then the last item, which is the interesting one. There is something noticing all of this. Turn round and look at it. What almost everybody finds, doing that honestly, is not nothing. It is that whatever they turn to look at has moved. There is always something doing the noticing. It is never the thing being noticed, and it will not hold still long enough to be inspected. It is like trying to catch a torch beam by pointing it at itself. And that, precisely that, is where the strongest objection lives, and it came from the tradition growing up beside him rather than from anywhere in Europe. The teachers of the older Indian schools were running an identical procedure. They also went through a person stripping things away, the body, the feelings, the thoughts, saying at each stage, not this, not this. What they concluded at the end is the opposite of what he concluded, and their reason is the thing you have just walked into. Of course, you cannot find the self among the objects, they said. It is not an object. It is what is looking at the objects. You cannot see the seer of seeing. You cannot hear the hearer of hearing. You cannot think the thinker of thinking, or know the knower of knowing. That it had moved when you turned around is not evidence of absence. It is exactly what you would predict if the thing you are hunting for is the hunting. And what is left when everything else has been stripped off is not a gap, but Atman, Ahtman, the self, unchanging, and the deepest version of that claim is that it is not even personal, that it is the same in you as in everyone, that what looks out of your eyes is what looks out of all of them. That is not a weak position. It is one of the most beautiful ideas anybody has had. Serious people hold it today, and it accounts for exactly the same evidence he was accounting for. Two traditions look. Both fail to find a thing, and one concludes there is no such thing, while the other concludes it is not the sort of thing that can be found. No experiment separates them, which is more or less where a young Scotsman arrived on his own, in a French village in the 1730s, with none of this in front of him. David Hume was in his 20s and writing what became one of the great books of European philosophy, and when he reached the question of personal identity, he reported this. When I enter most intimately into what I call myself, he wrote, I always stumble on some particular perception of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I never can catch myself at any time without a perception, and never can observe anything but the perception. A person, he concluded, is nothing but a bundle of perceptions following one another with inconceivable rapidity. Then he compared the mind to a theatre, and then did something I have always admired, which is that he took it straight back. The comparison must not mislead us, he wrote. There is no theatre. We have not the most distant notion of the place where these scenes are represented. There is a real possibility, argued carefully by a philosopher who went into the archives, that he did not get there entirely unaided. He was writing at a Jesuit college in France, where one of the residents had spent years in Siam, living among Buddhist monks, and had talked at length with a missionary just returned from a long study of Tibetan Buddhism. Their time there overlapped. Nobody has produced a document showing they discussed it. What has been established is opportunity, which is not proof and is not nothing. And here is the part that deserves to be better known than the bundle. In an appendix, Hume returned to all of it and said he could not make it work, that he found himself in a labyrinth and knew neither how to correct his opinion nor how to render it consistent. He is the only person in this chapter who admitted defeat in print. And then there is the thing that unsettles the whole tidy account, which is that when somebody came and asked the question directly, he would not answer. A wanderer turned up and asked him whether there is a self. He said nothing. The man asked whether there is no self. He said nothing again, and the wanderer went away. Afterwards, his attendant asked what that had been about, and the reply is preserved. If I had said there is a self, he said, I would have joined the people who believe in an eternal soul. And if I had said there is no self, then this man, who is already confused, would have walked off believing he used to have one and has now mislaid it. So the sentence everybody quotes, that Buddhism teaches there is no self, is a flattening of the one thing he specifically refused to say. What he handed people instead was the procedure, and let them run it themselves. Look at each thing you might be, and ask whether it obeys you, and whether it stays still, and whether it is worth calling yours. He would not convert the result into a proposition, and I have slowly come round to thinking that was precision rather than evasion, because the proposition, stated either way, is the one thing nobody can check. There is a demonstration coming that you do not have to arrange. In a little while, the entire apparatus we have spent this long failing to locate is going to stop. Not slow down, stop. For some hours tonight, there will be nobody in this room holding a point of view about anything, no continuous observer keeping the thread, and the genuinely odd part is that this happens every night of your life and has never once frightened you. Nobody lies down dreading the interruption. You look forward to it. And in the morning, something will sit up entirely certain that it is you with no gap anywhere in it, and it will not have checked, and it will not feel any need to, and the certainty will be delivered free along with the light. Whatever that certainty is made of, it survives being switched off nightly, which is either the most reassuring fact about being a person or the strangest, and it will still be available to be taken either way after breakfast. There is nothing to keep hold of now, not even the one doing the holding. Let the whole assembly come apart for a few hours. It has done this thousands of times, and it has always found its way back together by morning. She had a child, and the child died, and she would not have it. What the accounts describe is a woman carrying a small body around a village asking for medicine. Not asking for help with a burial, asking for medicine, house to house, holding the child out and wanting to know whether anybody has anything that will work, while people back away from the doorway because there is nothing to say to somebody in that condition and everyone can see what she cannot. Her name was Kisu Gotami, and in the end, somebody, out of kindness or to get her off the step, told her there was a man staying at the edge of town who might have what she was after. He did not tell her the child was dead. He did not explain impermanence to her or offer her a framework or say any of the things that would get said now. He said, "Yes, I can make that medicine, and I need one ingredient. Bring me a handful of mustard seed. Mustard seed is nothing. It is in every kitchen in the country." She would have been through the door before he finished the sentence. Then he added the condition. It has to come from a house where nobody has died. So she went, and this is the part I think gets misread, because it is taught as a lesson about impermanence, and it is not one. She already knew about impermanence. Everybody in a village in that century knew about impermanence. They buried children constantly, and she was not confused about the facts. She was destroyed by them, which is an entirely different condition and does not respond to information. What she got instead was an errand that took her to every door in the village in turn, and at every door she asked her question and received the same answer with a different name in it. Yes, of course. My father, 2 winters back. My daughter. My husband in the spring. Not this house. Not this one either. Nobody anywhere keeps that ingredient in stock. And what came apart in her on that route was not a belief about permanence. It was the belief that this had happened only to her. That is what grief does, and it is the cruelest thing about it. It convinces you, without any gaps, that nobody behind any of those lit windows could possibly understand what has occurred here, and the conviction is airtight and entirely false, and no argument on earth gets through it. Only the doors could. He did not give her a teaching, he gave her a walk. I should say where that story comes from because it matters. It is not in the earliest layer. It sits in a commentary written down centuries later, and the canonical material about this woman does not line up with it neatly. The traditions also pass the same episodes back and forth between the early nuns, so that a story attaches to one woman in one text and to somebody else in another, which is what happens to material that travels by mouth for 400 years before anybody thinks to write it down. None of which makes it untrue. It makes it a story the tradition told about itself and kept because it was true to something, and I would rather hand it over with the label attached than without. And there is a second woman, whose story could not be softened by anybody, and she is the reason I do not think any of this is sentimental. Her name was Patakara Puhta Cha Ra, and the accounts of what happened to her are almost absurd in their accumulation and are told without a single attempt to make them bearable. Her husband died of snakebite on a road. One of her 2 children was carried off by a bird of prey. The other drowned in a river she was crossing, in front of her, while she had the first one's body in her arms. She walked on towards her parents' town to tell them, and met somebody coming the other way who said that the house had come down in the night, and that her mother and her father and her brother were being burned at that moment, and she could see the smoke from where she stood. She lost her mind. That is in the text. She walked, and her clothes came off her, and she went through villages with nothing on, and people threw things at her, and it went on for a long time before she came near where he was teaching, and somebody covered her and brought her in. So when the teaching about pain arrives, it does not arrive as a comfortable notion addressed to comfortable people. What he says about it is arithmetic, and the image is a dart. Something happens to you, and that is the first one, and it goes in, and there is nothing to be done about that, and nobody in this tradition has ever pretended otherwise. Then, arriving immediately behind it, a second dart, and the second is fired from inside, so the man is struck twice and feels 2 pains where there was one, and only ever one of them was unavoidable. The first dart is what happened. The second is everything you subsequently do with it. The going back over, the rehearsal of the other version, the one where you left 10 minutes later or said the other thing or noticed in time, the demand that it should not have taken place, the forecast that it will now always be like this. None of that is the event. All of it is manufactured afterwards at considerable expense by the person it happened to. And he adds one detail that ties it to everything else. The man carrying 2 darts goes looking for relief in the only place he knows, which is pleasure, and goes after it hard, which is how a bad afternoon becomes the engine of the whole grabbing apparatus. Here is the objection, and it deserves proper strength, because the easy version of it does the argument no justice. Some losses ought to fire the second dart. A parent who loses a child and does not come apart has not achieved something. The rehearsing, the why, the refusal to accept the arrangement, the 4 in the morning conversations with somebody who is not in the room, that is not a fault bolted onto clean grief. It is love still running after the thing it was for has gone, with nowhere left to put itself, and it is not an optional extra that better training would let you decline. It is what one person is to another, and a philosophy that files it under avoidable has not understood what it is looking at. The sharper form is worse. The ideal being described is somebody who feels one pain where an ordinary person feels 2, but the second one is the human one, and the first is what any animal with a nervous system feels. Subtract the second and you have not produced a sage. You have produced something that can lose people without being much troubled, and there is clinical language for that. And there is a historical version of the complaint as well, which is that the tradition's answer to a woman who had lost everything was to make her a nun, which is either genuine repair or the most efficient possible removal of anything else that could ever be taken off her. What stops me accepting all of that is the tradition's own evidence against itself. Late in his life, the 2 men closest to him died within a few weeks of one another, both of them before he did. And what he said afterwards, in front of the assembly, is preserved, and it is not a lesson. He said that the assembly seemed empty to him now, that the direction those 2 had gone in looked empty to him. That is a man at the very top of the attainment his own system describes, standing in a room full of people and calling it empty because 2 of them are missing. So the target was never the absence of feeling. It cannot have been. What he is pointing at is narrower and more specific, and anybody who has actually grieved can find it from the inside, because the 2 things do not feel alike. There is the loss, which sits in the chest, has a weight, and requires no thinking from you whatsoever. And there is the loop at 3 in the morning, the conversation rewritten for the 9th time, the case argued at length against nobody. The first one moves. Over years, it changes shape and becomes something a person can carry. The second does not move at all. It runs the identical circuit indefinitely, produces nothing, honors nobody, and it is the only part of the entire business that was ever optional. Patakara came out the other side of hers, which is the fact I go back to whenever this teaching starts sounding cold to me. The moment is recorded in her own voice, in a collection of poems by the earliest nuns that somebody had the sense to keep, and it is not what anyone would expect. There was no revelation in it. She was washing her feet, and she watched the water run away down the slope, and some of it soaked in close by, and some ran further before it sank, and some went further still, and something in the watching of that gathered her up. And then that night, she says, she took the lamp into her cell and sat down on the bed and pushed the wick down into the oil with a needle to put it out. And the freeing of her mind, she says, was like the going out of the lamp. That is a woman who lost her husband and both her children and her parents and her brother inside a single week, and what she reaches for to describe the end of it is a small domestic action performed at bedtime, not a blaze, not a breaking open, a needle, a wick, and the dark coming in. You will have your own version of the loop, and this is more or less the hour it likes to start. There is a particular quality to the thinking that goes on in a dark room at this time, and part of what makes it so convincing is that it feels like work. It feels responsible. It feels as though you are finally attending to something the day was too crowded for. That feeling is the second dart's best disguise, and the tell is simple enough. Real thinking arrives somewhere. If you have gone round the same circuit 4 times and the ending has not altered, that is not thought. That is just the arrow going in again. And nothing in this room is asking you for it. There is nobody here to be convinced. No one has assembled at this hour to hear your account of what ought to have gone differently, and the walls have no position on the matter, and the case does not have to be made tonight in the dark to an empty chair. The thing that actually happened is still true, and it is not going anywhere, and it does not require guarding by you until morning. You can set it down on the floor beside the bed. Nothing in this room is going to move it, and nothing in this room is asking you to pick it up again tonight. Malunkyaputta Mulunkyu had been working on something alone for a long time, which is how most of the worst decisions get made. What had been working away at him was a small set of questions the teacher would not touch. He had noticed the pattern. Somebody would ask, and no answer would come, and the conversation would move along, and it had happened often enough by now that it had stopped looking like coincidence and started looking like policy. So he built an ultimatum in private, the way people do, and rehearsed it. He would put the questions directly. If they were answered, he would stay. If they were not, he would hand the robe back and go home and live an ordinary life, and that would be the end of it. You have been him about something at some point. There is a question you have let go unanswered long enough that the not answering has started to look deliberate, and you have built a private deadline round it that the other party knows nothing whatever about. And when you finally raise it, you will present it as a decision, though it is closer to a request to be talked out of something. He went, and he said the whole thing out loud, and what came back was not what he had prepared for. "Did I ever say to you," the teacher asked, "come and live this life under me and I will settle these questions for you?" "No. And did you ever say to me, I will live this life under you and you will settle them?" "No." "Then who exactly," he said, "are you giving notice to? And what do you imagine you are giving up?" Which is sharper than I expected the first time I met it. There is no consoling in it at all. He simply observes that the contract being broken was never signed by anybody, that Malunkyaputta had assembled the entire arrangement inside his own head and then come in to lodge a complaint about the breach. Then comes the arrow, which is why anybody remembers the exchange. Suppose a man is hit by an arrow, he says, and the arrow is thickly smeared with poison, and his family sends at once for a surgeon, and the man says, "Do not pull it out yet. Not until I know whether the man who shot me was a noble, or a priest, or a merchant, or a labourer. Not until I know his name and his family. Not until I know whether he was tall or short or middling, and whether his skin was dark or brown or golden, and which village he comes from. Not until I know whether the bow was a longbow or a crossbow, and whether the string was fibre or reed or sinew or hemp or bark, and whether the shaft was wild cane or cultivated, and what bird the feathers were taken from, vulture or heron or hawk or peacock, and what animal the binding was cut from, and what shape the head was, hooked or barbed or leaf-shaped." The list runs on considerably longer than it needs to, and the length is the joke. All of it, he says, would still be unknown to that man, and in the meantime, he would die. Whether the world is eternal or not eternal, there is still birth and aging and death and grief and pain and despair, and it is the ending of those that I am teaching here now. The questions themselves are worth having in front of you because they are not foolish and they were not asked by fools. Is the world eternal or did it begin? Is it infinite or does it have an edge somewhere? Is the living principle in a person the same thing as the body or something separate from it? And then the group people actually cared about, which comes in 4 parts rather than 2. After death, does an awakened person go on existing? Does he not exist? Does he both exist and not exist? Does he neither exist nor not exist? That 4-fold shape deserves a moment because it tells you these had been worked over by careful people. It is not a naive yes or no. Indian logic of the period had a habit of setting out 4 corners rather than 2, precisely to catch the cases where a flat yes and a flat no both come out wrong. The questioners had covered themselves. They had left him nowhere at all to stand, and he declined all 4. The reason everybody knows is the one the arrow gives, which is that the questions do not help. They are not connected to the work. You can hold any answer you like to any of them and remain in exactly the condition you were in. But there is a second reason, given elsewhere and repeated far less, and it is the interesting one. It is not only that the questions are unhelpful, it is that they are malformed. Something untrue has been built into them, and a question with a falsehood inside it has no correct answer, in the way that there is no honest yes or no available to a question about when you stopped doing a thing you never did. Take a length of rope and put a knot in it. The knot is real. You can find it in the dark. You can pull it tighter. You can hang weight from it. Now untie it and ask where the knot has gone. North? Into the rope somewhere? Does it still exist in some reduced condition, waiting? Nothing has gone anywhere because a knot was never the kind of thing that could go. It was a shape the rope was in. And where did it go is not a hard question awaiting better instruments. It is a question that has smuggled a noun into a place where there was only ever an arrangement. That is his claim about the last 4. Not that the answer is no, that the question has a rope in it and believes it has a knot. He made the point himself, more beautifully, to a wanderer who kept coming back with the same thing. Suppose there were a fire burning in front of you, he said. You would know that it was burning, and if it went out, you would know that too. Now, if somebody asked you which direction the fire had gone when it went out, north or south or east or west, what would you say to them? And the wanderer said the question does not apply. The fire burned because there was fuel for it. When the fuel is finished, the fire is described as gone out, and that is the whole of it. Just so, he said, everything by which such a person might be measured or described or pointed at has been given up. He is deep and hard to fathom, like the sea. which is not the same as saying there is nothing there. It is a refusal of the map rather than a report of a blank square on it, and I want to be careful about that, because both of the comfortable readings get him wrong. He is not offering you an afterlife, and he is not offering you the dark. Even the name he used for himself has this shape. It reaches English as the awakened one, but the word is Tathagata, tuh, and it will not settle into a translation, because it can be read as the one who has thus gone or the one who has thus come, and nobody has ever established which he intended. Now the case against him, which is stronger than people fond of this material tend to admit. Here is a man whose entire enterprise is about death, with several hundred people who have handed back their families and their property on his say-so, and he will not tell them what happens at the end. That is not necessarily precision. It is at least as likely to be a whole. The most economical explanation for anyone who will not answer a question has always been that they cannot. Read coldly, the arrow is not an argument at all. It is a change of subject. It moves the discussion off what is true and on to what is useful, which is precisely the maneuver people make when the first one is going badly for them. And the fire, for all its beauty, gives you nothing you could ever check. Ruling a question out of order is the oldest move available to somebody who does not wish to answer it, and it carries the considerable advantage of sounding wiser than an admission of ignorance. And there is a historical version of the complaint that I find harder to put down than either. His own tradition could not live with the silence. Within a few centuries, there were detailed cosmologies, elaborate afterlives, precise accounts of realms and durations and destinations, all of it produced by people who revered him and who plainly found the gap unbearable and filled it in. Whatever else the silence was, it did not hold, even among the people closest to him. I cannot settle this one, and I have been going back and forth for a long time. Some nights it reads as the most honest thing in the whole record. A man at the head of a religious tradition asked the question that religions exist to answer, declining to invent something. Nobody does that. The entire business model of the afterlife is that somebody tells you. He had every incentive and a completely captive audience, and he would not do it. Other nights it reads as a man with an unusually beautiful way of not saying, "I do not know." And what troubles me is that the two readings are indistinguishable from where I sit. They would produce the same texts and the same silence, and no amount of further reading is going to prise them apart. What can be said is that he was consistent, which is not nothing. He did not answer it quietly for the inner circle, and he did not answer it at the end, when a lie would have cost him almost nothing and comforted a great many people who loved him. And there is a small version of the whole thing coming to you shortly, which is why I have kept this chapter for this hour. Watch what happens to a question as you go under. Not the answering of it, because nothing gets answered at this stage of the evening, and you may have noticed that already. What happens is stranger and considerably more pleasant. The question loses its handle. It goes from being something you are holding to something you are merely near, to a shape with no edges left to take hold of, and at no point does it resolve, and at no point do you mind. You will not be able to say afterwards at what moment it stopped being askable. There is no line. There is only the fact that at one point you were turning something over, and at some later point there was nobody turning anything, and the not minding arrived some while before the not thinking did. He spent 45 years refusing to say where the fire goes. You are about to be shown, in miniature and at no cost whatever, what it is like when something quietly stops being a question at all. It has probably started already. A wave arriving on a beach in the west of Ireland may have begun as a disturbance off Newfoundland, 3,000 miles out, several days ago, and none of the water breaking on that sand has come from Newfoundland. The water at the shore has been sitting off that coast the whole time. What crossed the Atlantic was a shape, handed from one body of water to the next, each of them lifting and dropping back into place and passing it on, so that the only thing which travelled was a pattern of rising and falling. So did anything cross the ocean? Obviously it did. There is a wave, it has a size and a direction, and it will knock you over. Is it the same wave that started off Newfoundland? And there the question comes apart in your hands, because the honest answer is not yes and it is not no, and English does not supply a third word. That is the shape of the hardest problem in the whole of this material, and it is the one the tradition has never closed. He taught that there is nothing in a person that holds still, no owner standing behind the parts. He also taught at length everywhere, without a trace of hedging, that people are born again after they die, and that what comes next depends on what they did. Put those together and you have a genuine difficulty, and it is not a clever undergraduate objection. It is the objection. It was put to him while he was alive, and it has been put to every Buddhist philosopher since. If there is nobody in here, what gets reborn? And in its sharper form, the one with teeth in it. If no person continues, where is the justice in somebody suffering now for what was done by somebody else a lifetime ago? There is a monk in the texts who solved this on his own and was rather pleased with the solution. What he had worked out was that consciousness must be the thing that travels, that the same awareness runs on from one life to the next, changing bodies the way a man changes lodgings. It is the obvious answer. It is what almost everybody assumes the doctrine has to be. And when it got back to the teacher, the response is among the harshest anywhere in the record. "Misguided man," he said, "when have you ever heard me teach anything of the kind? Have I not said in 100 places that awareness arises depending on conditions, and that without its conditions it does not arise at all?" So the natural answer is ruled out by the founder himself. Nothing bright is making the crossing. What he puts there instead is the machinery underneath everything else he said, and the name is a mouthful in any language. Dependent arising, or in the original, patika samuppada, puti chusumupada, and the principle is short enough to hold at this hour. When this is, that comes to be. When this arises, that arises. When this is not, that does not come to be. When this ends, that ends. Nothing has to be a thing in order to have effects. Conditions give rise to conditions, and what results is not a substance but a continuing. The tradition draws that out into 12 links, and I am not going to march you through 12 of anything tonight. What is worth having is the short stretch in the middle, because that stretch is running in you at this moment and can be caught. Something makes contact, a sound in the street, a thought arriving unasked, the shape of the pillow against your ear. Out of the contact immediately comes a tone, pleasant or unpleasant or neither, and it is fast, and it is not a decision. Out of the tone comes a leaning, towards or away. Out of the leaning comes a grabbing, and out of the grabbing, which is the part that answers the whole question, comes a somebody. The self is not what enters the chain. The self is what the chain turns out. It gets manufactured at the far end, new every time round, to be the one who wanted the thing, which is why asking what is reborn has the same trouble folded into it as asking where a wave keeps its water. Nothing is reborn because there was never a thing there to be born in the first place. What continues is the process that keeps producing somebodies. That handles the metaphysics and leaves the justice question standing, and there is an answer to that one too, which arrives in a courtroom. A man is caught taking mangoes from another man's tree, and he defends himself with exactly the argument you would expect from somebody who has been reading this material. "These are not the mangoes you planted," he says. "The ones you put in the ground are long gone. These are different mangoes entirely, and I have taken nothing of yours." The king finds against him without much trouble, on the grounds that the fruit on the tree exists because of the fruit in the ground, and that a chain of causes has always been quite sufficient for ownership in every legal system anybody has ever operated. You do not need an unchanging essence inside a mango to make a theft, which is sturdier than it first looks, because it is the answer we already use for everything. Nobody thinks the man sentenced at 60 for what he did at 30 is a different person in the metaphysical sense that would let him walk. He is joined on by a chain of causes, and that is all anyone ever meant. Something else is worth getting straight, because it changes the temperature of all of it. In that world, rebirth was not a consolation, it was the sentence. Nobody there was hoping for it. What is being described is an unthinkable stretch of time in which you keep coming back into good conditions and appalling ones, over and over, with no memory of the previous round and no end in sight. It is nearer to the diagnosis of a chronic condition than to any promise of survival. Sit inside that for a moment and the fear reorganizes itself. Dying is not what frightens you, because dying is not the problem. Dying is the thing that keeps failing to work. What frightens you is that it does not stop. And the entire apparatus, the walking and the sitting and the handing back of property and family, is aimed at one outcome, which is not going round again. Where the idea came from in the first place is, as it happens, still being argued over. Karma and rebirth are nearly absent from the oldest Indian religious texts, and then turn up in the later ones abruptly and fully assembled, which is not how ideas usually behave. One serious argument holds they were not originally Vedic at all, that they entered the priestly tradition from the East, out of a separate culture in the region he actually grew up in, where they had been worked on for centuries first. Other scholars think the development is continuous and the Eastern origin is overstated. Nobody has settled it, which means the assumption he inherited may have been a good deal newer and more local than it looks from this distance. There were people at the time who thought the whole framework was rubbish, and one of them put it with real economy. A person is 4 elements, he said. At death, the earth in you goes back to earth, the water to water, the heat to heat, the air to air. 4 men carry the bier to the burning ground. The bones go the colour of a dove, the offerings end in ash. Wise and foolish are cut off alike, and after death there is not anything. That was a scandalous position in his century. It is now more or less the working assumption of most educated people alive, and in all likelihood yours. So it is not a historical curiosity produced here for the sake of balance. It is the water most of us swim in, and it means a great many people who admire this material are quietly running it with the engine removed, which brings the harder objection, and it should be said plainly. Rebirth is not decoration applied to the outside of this teaching. It is structural. The problem being solved is not that life is hard, it is that it does not stop. Take rebirth out, and the diagnosis changes meaning entirely, because if death is simply the end, then death is the liberation. And 45 years of walking is a very long way round to something a stroke provides for nothing. The tradition has never been coy about the goal. The goal is not calm, the goal is not going round again. And the honest reply from the other side is that the person doing the deleting is not being careless. They are applying his own standard. He was the one who said not to take things on authority, and rebirth is precisely the sort of claim nobody can check. So the modern edit is being performed with his own instrument, on his own doctrine, which is either a betrayal or the most faithful thing anybody could do with it, and that argument is nowhere near finished. Here is the fact that settled my own sense of how open this remains. Within a few centuries of his death, a Buddhist school emerged holding that there is, after all, a person. Not a soul exactly, not identical with the parts, and not entirely separate from them either, but a something carried across, doing the work the parts could not manage alone. Every other school called it heresy, and said so at length. and they were also, for a very long time, enormous. When Chinese pilgrims crossed India centuries later and counted monasteries, this supposedly heretical school turned out to be among the largest in the country. A substantial share of all the Buddhists in India held the position their own tradition had formerly ruled out. They are a footnote now, and the size of that footnote tells you something. The line he drew was extraordinarily hard to stand on, and the people who had given their whole lives to standing on it kept sliding off. You accept a version of this yourself, without evidence, every day. There is a photograph somewhere of you as a small child. You share almost no material with that child. You have none of their opinions, most of their memories are gone, and if the two of you were introduced, you would struggle for conversation. Nobody has ever shown you the thread. You are certain it is you, and you are right, and if pressed to say what makes it so, you would end up talking about causes and continuity and nothing else at all, which is the answer he gave. The body is running the same trick underneath you at this moment. Most of the material in you now was not in you 10 years ago, though not all of it, since a few cells stay for the duration. You have been substantially replaced several times over and did not notice on any occasion. It happened at night, mostly in hours like this one, with nobody supervising. It will carry on through the night without you. Nothing in the handover needs your attention or your permission or your continued presence, and none of it has ever once required holding together by the part of you that worries about holding things together. Let that part go off duty. The wave does not need to know it is a wave in order to keep arriving. They gave the elephant toddy until it was drunk, and then they let it out into a narrow street in the city at the hour they knew he would be walking down it. The animal was a bull with a reputation, and a drunk bull elephant in a lane between houses is not a threat. It is an outcome. People got up onto the roofs. Somebody shouted at him to turn back. The accounts say he did not move, and that the elephant came down the street and slowed and stopped in front of him, and that he put a hand on its head. Whatever you make of the ending, the beginning is a matter of record, and there is nothing miraculous in it. Somebody paid the keepers, somebody chose that street and knew the timetable, and the somebody was his cousin. Devadatta, Devadutta, had grown up beside him and had ordained along with the rest of the Sakyan nobility when the family came over in a group, and for a long stretch of the record there is nothing at all against him. He was a serious monk with real attainments and a following of his own. What went wrong began with a proposal. The teacher was old by then, well into his 70s, and Devadatta stood up in front of the assembly and said something that can be read as consideration and can be read as a coup. The Blessed One is aged now, worn down, burdened with years. Let him live at his ease. Let him hand the community over to me. What came back is among the strangest lines in the canon, because it is neither calm nor kind. I would not hand the community over to Sariputta and Moggallana, he said, naming the two men he trusted most, let alone to you. And then he called him a name that translators have been softening for 2 centuries, which in its plainest reading means something close to eater of spit. That is worth sitting with, because it is exactly the sort of thing that gets left out of the summaries. The man at the center of the world's great tradition of non-hatred in front of a full assembly called his cousin a spit-licker. It is in the text. Nobody took it out. Whatever else it tells you he was capable of contempt and did not always keep it behind his teeth. After that, it escalates in a way that reads like farce until you remember that somebody meant it. He hired a man to do the killing, then hired 2 men to kill that man on his way back, then 4 for the 2, then 8 for the 4, then 16, presumably so that nothing could be traced to anyone. Every one of them, according to the account, arrived, listened, and joined the order instead. Then he tried it himself and pushed a rock off the hillside above where the teacher was walking, and it broke on the way down, and a splinter went into his foot and drew blood. which is the only injury from an attack recorded anywhere in his life. Then the elephant. And when none of it worked, he did the thing that actually caused damage, which was to walk out and take 500 monks with him. The community split. The tradition's own account of the repair is close to comic. The two chief disciples went over to the breakaway camp, talked through the night, and brought everybody home while Devadatta was asleep, so that he woke up in an empty field. He died not long afterwards, and the accounts of how are lurid and disagree with each other, and one strand has him repenting on the road back and dying before he got there. Centuries later, a great Mahayana text went further still and declared that he had been on the path the whole time and would himself become a Buddha, which is either a magnificent act of forgiveness or a tradition finding a use for its own villain. And that, I think, is the thing to notice about Devadatta. He is the failure the tradition is comfortable handing you. There is a jealous cousin, there is an elephant, none of it is the teacher's doing, and you can set the story down, feeling the record has been honest with you. The harder failures are the ones where nobody is a villain. His half-brother was called Nanda, and the story of how Nanda became a monk is told cheerfully by the tradition, and I have never managed to read it cheerfully once. The fullest version is late, so take the details loosely, but the outline holds, and the sequel is canonical. It was near enough Nanda's wedding day. He was being installed as heir and married in the same season, and his bride was watching from an upper window as he saw his brother to the door. And the teacher, leaving, handed Nanda his begging bowl, and then simply kept walking and did not take it back. So Nanda, holding a bowl belonging to a man he could not very well interrupt, followed him out of politeness. Out of the house, through the streets, all the way to the grove where the monks were staying, waiting for the moment when it would be decent to hand the thing over. The moment did not arrive. He was ordained that day, and the last thing he heard from the window was his bride calling after him to come back quickly. He was wretched for a long time and made no secret of it, and wanted to go home. What he was given was not consolation, but an incentive. He was shown celestial women and told that the practice would win him better company than the girl at the window, and he stayed for that reason and worked hard for that reason, and the other monks mocked him openly as a man labouring for wages. He got there in the end, and the tradition presents the whole sequence as skillful handling. I find it very hard to read as anything other than a man taking his brother's life off him on a technicality and then bribing him to accept the loss. And then there is the passage that has done the most damage of anything in this literature, and it begins with the woman who raised him. Mahapajapati, Muhapajapati, was his mother's sister, and she fed him and brought him up after his mother died in the week of his birth, and by the time of this episode, she was old. She came and asked that women be permitted to go forth, to leave their households and live as the men were living. He refused. She asked again. He refused again. She asked a third time, and he refused a third time, and then he left the town. So she cut off her hair and put on the ochre robe and walked. The distance was considerable. She was not young, and she went on foot, and 500 Sakyan women went with her. They arrived at the gate where he was staying with their feet swollen and split open and dust over all of them, and she stood outside it and wept. It was Ananda, his attendant, who found her there and asked what had happened, and who then went in and did the thing that turned it. He did not plead. He asked a question. Are women capable, if they go forth, of reaching the goal? And the answer was yes, they are capable. Then Ananda said, in that case, and given that this woman nursed you and gave you her own milk when your mother died, let her go forth. And he agreed. Attached to the agreement are 8 conditions, and they are not minor. Under them, any nun of any standing defers to any monk, including one ordained that morning, so that a woman of 40 years in the robe rises for a boy of 19. And in the same passage sits the sentence that has been used against women in this tradition ever since. Had women not gone forth, he is made to say, the teaching would have lasted 1,000 years, and now it will last 500. The images around it are uglier than the arithmetic. A household with many women and few men is easily entered by robbers, and this is like mildew in a field of rice and blight in a field of cane. I have been telling you where things come from, so here is what can honestly be said about that passage. It does not sit right. The commentary attached to the very same text contradicts the root and gives the figure as 1,000. A later and hugely influential commentator raises it to 5,000. He makes no other precise prediction of that kind anywhere, about anything. The 8 conditions arrive fully assembled before there is a single none for them to be applied to, which is not how any other rule in that code was built, since the rest are laid down one at a time in answer to something that has actually happened. And when the account is compared across the separate monastic traditions that preserved it independently, the versions do not line up, which is what you would expect from material worked on after the schools divided rather than before. None of which lets anybody off. The honest verdict is not that he said it, and it is not that he did not. It is that the text is arguing with itself, that some of it is almost certainly later, that nobody can say which part, and that the uncertainty has never once slowed down the people using it. The defense deserves real weight because it is not nothing. In that century, in that country, there was no route whatsoever for a woman to religious standing, and he built one. He stated on the record that women are as capable of the goal as men, which is the doctrinally decisive point and which no amount of procedural subordination cancels. Hundreds of women left their households and did it, and the poems they wrote about it were kept and survive and are the oldest collection of women's writing anywhere on earth. Women describing their own freedom in their own words, carried for 2,000 years inside a canon copied out by men. That is extraordinary, and it was extraordinary then. It also does not close the question, because extraordinary for his time is the argument that has been entered on behalf of every injustice that was ever ordinary. And this is not a historical matter. Full ordination for women lapsed in the Theravada countries centuries ago, and the fight over whether it can be restored is going on now, in this decade, in monasteries and committees and courtrooms, and women who take the robes are refused recognition in more than one country on the authority of a passage that contradicts itself. So you are being asked to judge somebody, and I am not going to do it on your behalf. What I will point at is the shape the failures make when you put them side by side. He took his son. He took his brother, more or less by sleight of hand. Removing people from their lives seems to have cost him very little, and the one occasion on record where somebody wanted the opposite, where somebody came asking to be let in rather than being quietly led out, he said no, and then no again, and then no a third time. And it took an old woman walking a long road barefoot and a younger man asking a good question to move him. That asymmetry is not explained anywhere, and I do not think it can be explained away. It is also worth knowing what a verdict reached at this hour is actually worth. Judgments made in the dark run harsher than the ones made in daylight, without exception about everybody, and the person they usually run hardest on is not a man who has been dead for 25 centuries. You have been handed a genuinely difficult one tonight, and there is no deadline attached to it. His own tradition has had 2,500 years and has not filed a verdict either. Nothing in the next few hours turns on you reaching one, and whatever you think in the morning will be fairer than anything available now, and it will keep until then. He is not going anywhere. Neither for the moment are you. The famine went on for 12 years. There had been an invasion from the mainland first, and then the crops failed, and then they kept failing, and by the end of it, People in Sri Lanka were eating things that do not turn up in any account written by somebody comfortable. The monasteries emptied. Monks who could still walk went to the coast and crossed to India. Monks who could not walk stayed where they were and died there. And inside that ordinary catastrophe was a particular kind of loss that almost nobody outside those buildings would have recognized at the time, because the entire teaching, every discourse, and every rule, and every account of what the man had said and to whom existed nowhere on earth except inside the heads of the men who were starving. Not mostly, entirely. There was no copy anywhere. 4.5 centuries after his death, it was still being carried the way it had always been carried, out loud by memory, from one person to the next, and one sufficiently bad decade could have taken the whole of it off the planet. So, when the famine finally broke, the survivors did the thing the tradition had refused to do for 400 years. They gathered at a cave temple at a place called Aluvihare, Aluvihare, several hundred of them, and recited the entire canon aloud, and this time somebody wrote it down, on palm leaf with a stylus, over a long stretch of time. And the reason it happened at all, the reason there is anything to talk about tonight, is that a generation of men had just watched their friends die and had worked out that a library made of people is only as durable as the people. How it lasted that long takes you back to the weeks just after he died, when 500 senior monks met at a cave outside the city to establish what the teaching actually was, before anybody's memory began drifting or anybody's opinion began improving it. And there was an immediate problem, which is one of my favorite things in the whole record. The man who had heard everything was not qualified to attend. Ananda had been the attendant for 25 years. He had been in the room for nearly every conversation. He had a reputation for total recall and was, in practical terms, the archive. He had also not yet reached awakening, and the council was for those who had, and the senior monks would not bend the rule, not even for the only man who could recite the material they had come to establish. So he sat up all night working at it, and the tradition's account of what happened is among the strangest and best details in the literature. He gave up near dawn, worn out, and decided to lie down. And it happened, they say, in the gap, after his feet had left the floor and before his head reached the pillow. Not standing, not walking, not sitting, not lying. In the interval between two postures, which is not a place anybody can arrange to be. He walked into the council in the morning, and then they put him on trial. Nothing grave, but he was made to answer for a list of failings, that he had pressed for women to be admitted, that he had not asked the teacher to stay alive longer when the chance was there, that he had let weeping women near the body, that he had once trodden on the hem of a robe while mending it. He said he could see no fault in any of it, and confessed anyway, out of deference to the assembly. So the man who preserved the entire tradition spent his first morning of it being told off by the people who were about to receive it from him. Then he recited. And that is why nearly every discourse in the canon opens with the same 4 words. Thus have I heard. Not thus it is, not the truth is. A first-person claim about hearing, made by a particular man who was in the room, sitting on the front of every text like a signature on a witness statement. 2,500 years of scripture, and the standard opening line is somebody saying, "This is what I heard somebody say," which raises the question everybody eventually asks, which is how any of it held still for 400 years with nothing written down. The answer is that it did not hold still by luck, and once you see the machinery, you cannot stop seeing it, and it changes how the texts read. There were specialist orders of reciters, each responsible for one collection and nothing else. A monk would take on the long discourses and give his life to them. Another took the middle-length ones, another the numbered ones. They were not scholars, they were carriers, and each lineage handed its collection down the way a trade is handed down. Then there is the shape of the material, and this is the part that reframes something you may already have noticed. Everybody who opens these texts complains about the same thing. The repetition is relentless. The same formulas, the same stock phrases, the same lists, over and over, and where a modern translator writes and so on for the rest, the original grinds through every permutation in full. It reads like bad writing. It is not writing at all, it is error correction. A formula is a shape you can feel a hole in. If a phrase has a fixed form and a word goes missing, the line limps and everybody in the room hears it. The tedium is not a defect in the literature. The tedium is the reason there is any literature. And they did not recite alone. The word for one of those great councils means at root, a chanting together, and that is what it was. A room of men saying the same text in unison, which is not one memory, but dozens running in parallel and checking each other, so that one person's drift is simply drowned by everybody else's accuracy. Even the numbering does work. The endless 4s and 5s and 8-folds that make this tradition look like a filing cabinet are a filing cabinet. You cannot quietly lose the 4th item out of a set of 4, none of which stopped it splitting because he had appointed no successor and had refused to. Roughly a century after the death, another council met, and the dispute that opened the community up was not about the self or the ending of suffering. It was about whether monks could accept money and how late in the day a person could still eat, and a handful of other points of housekeeping. The strict side won the vote, the other side went away unconvinced, and not long afterwards the community divided for the first time. The Great Schism began over lunch and petty cash. Then, a few generations later, it acquired an improbable patron. Ashoka, Ashoku, ruled very nearly the whole subcontinent, and early in his reign he took a kingdom on the east coast called Kalinga, Kulingu, and the figures we have for it are his own. 100,000 killed, 150,000 deported, many times that number dead afterwards of everything that follows a war. And then he had his remorse carved into rock, not his victory, his regret. Cut into cliff faces and onto pillars across an empire, in the ordinary languages people actually spoke, addressed to farmers and traders, saying that the conquest sat heavily on him and that he wished it undone. Nothing else like it survives from the ancient world. Kings did not do that. He also sent his own son south to Sri Lanka, carrying the teaching, which is how it came to be on the island where, 2 centuries later, a famine drove it onto palm leaves. And there is one more thing about those inscriptions that I find almost unbearable. They stood in the open, beside roads and in towns for 2,000 years, and nobody could read a word of them. The script had died. They were odd marks on old stone that 60 generations of people walked past without a thought, until an English official in Calcutta worked out the alphabet in the 1830s, and the oldest hard evidence for any of this abruptly began speaking again. Now the case against, which is stronger than all that machinery makes it sound. There is no document from his lifetime, no inscription, no contemporary mention, no independent witness of any kind. The first genuinely hard evidence is Ashoka, 2 centuries later at the very least, and everything before that is the tradition's account of itself, which is not evidence in any sense a historian would accept in another field. And the sharpest version of the objection takes the machinery and turns it around. Oral traditions do not preserve, they reperform, and reperformance is composition. Worse, the formulas that keep the material stable are exactly what makes it impossible to date from the inside. A formula can be dropped into a text at any point across 400 years, and it will look precisely as old as everything around it. The device that stopped the material drifting is the same device that conceals every later hand. Which is why the honest position among people who spend their working lives on this is narrower than either the believers or the debunkers would like. The actual words of the actual man are not recoverable. What is recoverable, and it is not nothing, is what the earliest generations were convinced he had said. There is one real instrument for getting at that. The Pali collection is not the only survivor. Other schools, which had gone their own way centuries earlier and travelled north and east, carried their own versions, and translations of some of them come down to us in Chinese. So you can lay two collections side by side that parted company before most of the later development happened and look at where they agree. Where they do, you are standing behind the split, in material older than the argument that caused it. It does not hand you a man. It hands you the shape of what was being carried before anyone had a motive to alter it, which is as close as anybody's going to get. Which leaves the arrangement you happen to be in at this moment, and it is worth noticing because it is not incidental. Every link in that chain was a person in a room at night with a voice going and nothing in front of them. That is what the whole apparatus was built for, and it is the only thing it was ever built for. The palm leaves came late and came reluctantly, and came only because people were dying. The ordinary condition of this material for the first 4 centuries, and for most of the 20 since, has been a voice in the dark and somebody lying there taking it in. There is nothing in this room but that. No page, no test, nothing that has to be got right. The 4 words at the head of all those texts are not a claim about truth. They are a description of a situation, and it is exactly the situation you are in now, and it has been somebody's situation every night for a very long time. Whatever else went missing in the handing along, that part has not changed. Somebody talks quietly at an unreasonable hour. Somebody else lies still and listens until they cannot any longer. You are the current end of a very long line, and the only thing this end has ever had to do is be awake for some of it. On the 14th of October, 1956, several 100,000 people came to a field on the edge of Nagpur, in central India, and by the end of the afternoon, none of them were Hindus anymore. Nobody agrees on the number. The lowest careful estimate is somewhere near 380,000. Other accounts go past 500,000. What is not in dispute is that it was the largest single act of religious conversion that has ever taken place in one location on one day, and that the man who had organized it had 6 weeks left to live. His name was Bhimrao Ambedkar, A.M. Bedkar, and he was, by a considerable distance, the most educated person in Indian public life. A doctorate from Columbia, another from the London School of Economics, called to the bar in London. He had also been born into a caste so far down the order that as a schoolboy he was not permitted to touch the water tap and had to wait for somebody of higher standing to pour water into his cupped hands from above, and on the days when nobody could be bothered, he did not drink. He wrote the Constitution of Independent India. He chaired the committee that drafted it, and the clause abolishing untouchability is his. And having done that, having written the abolition into the founding law of his own country, he concluded that law was not going to be sufficient, because what he was up against was not a statute. It was a religion, 3,000 years old, and it had a place assigned for him inside it. He had announced what he intended to do about it 21 years earlier, in a single sentence at a conference. "I was born a Hindu," he said, "but I will not die a Hindu." Then he spent 2 decades reading, because he had no intention of doing it carelessly. He examined Islam and Christianity and Sikhism, and the objection he kept coming back to was the same each time. Every one of them would have required his people to accept an authority arriving from outside. He wanted something grown in the same soil that owed nothing to any god. So he took the man from the deer park. On that afternoon, he received the refugees from an elderly monk, and then turned round and administered them to the crowd himself, several 100,000 people at once, and attached 22 vows of his own composition, which appear in no canon anywhere and consist largely of renunciations, one after another, of every god and right and obligation of the order he was walking out of. There is a detail that makes what he did stranger and better, which is that Buddhism was not native to India any longer. It had died there. The great monasteries and universities of the north were burned in the invasions of the 12th and 13th centuries. What remained was gradually absorbed back into the Hindu order, and by the modern period, the country that produced this teaching had almost no Buddhists left in it. The census of 1951 counted about 180,000 in the whole of India. 10 years later, it counted over 3 million. The teaching had survived by emigrating, had been kept alive for 700 years in other people's countries, and was then brought home by a lawyer from an untouchable caste. And here it gets complicated, because what he brought home was not what had left. Ambedkar's Buddhism is a rebuild. He rejected the Four Truths outright, in print, on the grounds that no teaching which opens by announcing that existence is unsatisfactory could possibly have attracted a following, and that they must therefore be a later insertion by monks. He had no use at all for rebirth or for karma in anything like the traditional sense. What he kept was the ethics, the rejection of caste, the insistence that a person's worth is not allocated at birth, and the fact that the whole apparatus runs without a god in it anywhere. The book he wrote to set this out is regarded across much of the Buddhist world as heterodox at best. It also gave several million people a way to stop being untouchable, which no orthodoxy had managed in 3,000 years. Which is the thing I want to put down before any of the rest, because otherwise this becomes a lament about corruption, and a lament would be dishonest. There is no pristine version sitting somewhere being spoiled. There is a very long queue of people picking this material up and putting it to work, beginning with the men who wrote down what they remembered and running without a break to whoever last told you to be present. Every one of them selected. Every one of them left things out. The real question about any given version is not whether it has been altered, since all of them have, but what it is being used for. Europe's turn came in the 1800s, and what is worth knowing about the European reading is how little it had to work with. Arthur Schopenhauer, did more than anybody to make this material intelligible to educated Europe. He kept a gilt Buddha on a console in his study in Frankfurt and called it the finest of all religions. He was also assembling the picture out of missionary reports, travellers' accounts, and the early journals of colonial learned societies, and the Indian philosophy that shaped him most came to him through a Latin rendering of a Persian rendering of the Sanskrit. He claimed to have reached his own conclusions before encountering any of it, and to have found the agreement afterwards, which may even be true. What matters is that the version he passed on was built on very little, and that it held, and that for a century afterwards, educated Europeans knew precisely one thing about this teaching, and the thing they knew was wrong. The most recent use is the one you have almost certainly met, and it started in a hospital. In 1979, a medical researcher in Massachusetts began a program for patients with chronic pain that conventional medicine had run out of ideas for. He took the attention practices and removed everything else. No rebirth, no ethics, no monks, no Pali, nothing that would get the program thrown out of a teaching hospital. He was open about the choice, describing the stripping down as a delivery mechanism, a way of getting something useful through a door that would otherwise have stayed shut. And it worked. It has helped an enormous number of people in genuine distress, and anybody who sneers at that has not sat in a room with somebody in chronic pain. Then it kept going, and what it became is harder to defend. It went into corporations as a productivity intervention. It went into schools. It went into armies, where soldiers are trained in sustained attention in order to perform better under fire, which is a use of this material that would have required some explaining in the deer park. And the criticism that has stuck is that a technique for remaining calm, sold to people whose distress is being manufactured by their conditions, is not a liberation. It is maintenance. You are being taught to breathe steadily through an arrangement that ought to be changed, and the steady breathing makes the arrangement more sustainable, and the arrangement is the thing that was hurting you. That objection has an older and much heavier version, aimed at the whole teaching rather than at its commercial end. The doctrine puts the cause of suffering inside the person. Apply that to somebody being ground down by an unjust order, and you have built the most effective pacification device anyone has ever produced, because you have persuaded the victim that the real difficulty is their own attachment to not being crushed. And the history offers no comfort. This tradition has sat beside monarchies and empires and caste orders for 2,500 years with very little friction. Zen institutions in Japan lined up almost without exception behind the militarism of the 1930s and 40s and supplied it with a vocabulary. In Sri Lanka and in Myanmar, within living memory, and within this decade, Buddhist monks have led nationalist movements, and in Myanmar, monks were prominent in a campaign against the Muslim minority that drove some 750,000 people across a border. Not fringe figures, popular preachers with vast followings quoting the same texts, so the charge is not hypothetical and cannot be waved through, and the answer to it is standing in a field outside Nagpur. The same doctrine, in the hands of a man who had spent his childhood being refused water, became the instrument of the largest act of political refusal in modern Indian history. Not a withdrawal from the world, a public, organized mass rejection of an entire social order carried out under the authority of a teaching that his opponents had spent decades insisting was about detachment, which means neither side gets to keep it. It is not inherently pacifying, and it is not inherently liberating. It is a set of unusually powerful instruments for working on a mind, and instruments are picked up by whoever happens to be standing nearest, and the man who assembled them refused to appoint anybody to decide who that would be. I should say where I stand in this, since running the argument from outside, it would be dishonest. Nearly everything I met first came from the sold-back version. I had been doing the breathing for years before I understood that the ethics were not a moral supplement, but a load-bearing part of the machine. I could have talked to you about being present long before I could have told you what the presence was supposed to be for. I do not think what I was handed was worthless because it did me good. I think it was incomplete in a way that was extremely convenient for the people distributing it, and I did not notice for a long time, and I am not certain I would ever have noticed if I had not gone looking for where it came from. Which leaves you with a question nobody asked you to take on. You have absorbed some of this already. Let it go, be present, don't be so attached, everything passes. Those sentences are ambient now, arriving from advertising and applications and people at work, and each one is a filed down fragment of something. At some point it is worth knowing which version you are running and what it is for, and who benefits from you being calm about the particular thing you are being calm about. But not tonight. And there is one part of all this that nobody has ever managed to sell, and it is where you are going now. Nothing can be done with the last few minutes before sleep. It cannot be optimized. It produces no output and improves no performance, and has never once been packaged, for the straightforward reason that there is nothing in it to package. It is the one region of human experience that has held out against every attempt to put it to work, because the moment you try to use it, it stops. And that is roughly the shape of the thing this whole tradition was pointing at, and it is available to you at no cost tonight, without instruction from anybody. You will notice the words getting further apart and harder to hold on to. Nothing is being asked of you. Nobody is measuring any of it. Whatever has been trying all evening to make something out of the day is going quiet now, and it was the only part of you that ever wanted this to be useful. Let that part go first. Out of all of that, out of the empires and the councils and the arguments and the crowds in the field, back down to one road in the north of India, and an old man walking on it who has perhaps 3 months left. He was 80, and he said so, without any softening. "I am old now, worn out, one who has gone the distance, and I have come to the end of my time." And then he gave them the image himself, which is not the sort of image a tradition would have invented for its founder. "This body," he said, "keeps going the way an old cart keeps going, which is by being strapped together." There had already been a warning. During the last rains he had fallen seriously ill, with pains he described as sharp enough to finish him, and he had held them off deliberately because it seemed to him improper to go without speaking to the community first. When he recovered, his attendant told him what the fright had done. "My body has gone weak," Ananda said. "Everything has gone unclear to me, and the only comfort I had was that surely he would not pass away without leaving instructions for the order, and the answer to that is one of the plainest things he ever said." "What does the community expect of me, Ananda? I have taught without keeping anything back. There is nothing here that the Tathagata holds to the last with the closed fist of a teacher who is saving something, and then refusing the role even at the end. I am not one who thinks it is I who will lead the community, or that the community depends on me." Then he gave them the line, and it is one of the most quoted sentences in the whole tradition, and the popular version of it is wrong twice over. "You will usually meet it as be a lamp unto yourself, which is beautiful and is almost certainly not what he said. The word can mean lamp and it can mean island, and the context is a flood. What is being described is high ground in rising water, a place that stays above it when everything around is going under. Be islands to yourselves," he said. "Be your own refuge, with no other." And then, in the same breath, the half that almost nobody carries away, "And let the teaching be your island, let the teaching be your refuge, with no other." He is not telling a room full of frightened people that they are on their own. He is telling them there is high ground and that they already have it, and that it does not require him to keep existing. At a place called Pava, a metalworker's son named Kunda, Chun-da, invited him to a meal. Among the dishes was something the texts call by a word nobody has been able to settle. It might be tender pork, it might be a truffle or a mushroom, the kind pigs root out of the ground, which is what the word could equally well mean. 2,500 years of scholarship and the tradition cannot agree on what was on the plate. He asked that it be served only to him and that the rest be buried, and shortly afterwards he became violently ill with dysentery and blood and severe pain, and he bore it, the text says, without complaining. And then, with that going on in him, he used some of what he had left to do the following. He told Ananda to go and find Kunda, because somebody was going to say to that man that it was his food that killed the Buddha, and he wanted the remorse dealt with before it started. "Tell him," he said, "that of all the meals ever given, 2 are of the very highest fruit, the one taken before the awakening and the one taken before the end. Tell him he has gained, not lost." I have read a great many accounts of how people behave in their last days. I do not know of another one where the dying man's concern is the reputation of whoever cooked. They kept walking. He was thirsty on the road and asked for water, and Ananda objected because 500 carts had just crossed the stream and churned it to mud, and there was a proper river not far ahead. He asked again. Ananda objected again. He asked a third time, and Ananda went. And the story says the water had settled clear, and you may take that as you find it. What is underneath the miracle is a sick old man asking 3 times for a drink, while his assistant argues the point with him. They came to Kusinara, and Ananda was distressed about it, and said so. "Do not let it happen here, in this miserable little town of Wattle and Daub, this jungle town, this branch township. There are great cities. There is Rajagaha, there is Savatthi, there is Benares. Let it happen somewhere that means something." He was unmoved. And so the whole of it ends where it ends, in a grove outside a place nobody outside that district had heard of. on a couch made up between a pair of sal trees, with the man lying on his right side, one foot resting on the other, awake and clear. At some point, Ananda could not manage it anymore and went off into one of the lodgings and stood there holding onto the doorpost and cried, and what he said to himself has been kept. I am still a learner with work still to do, and the teacher is going who was kind to me. They fetched him back. Enough, Ananda. Do not grieve. Have I not told you all along that everything we care for is of a nature to change and to be separated from us? How could it be otherwise? Whatever is born and put together is subject to coming apart. That it should not come apart is not a possible thing to ask for. And then he did something that the tradition, to its credit, wrote down in full. He turned to the assembly and praised his assistant in front of all of them. He told them Ananda was a remarkable man, that people who came to see him went away gladdened, and that this was a quality of great kings and also of this monk. 25 years of carrying somebody's bowl and standing outside somebody's door, and the man used part of his last afternoon to make sure it was said out loud while there were witnesses. There was one more piece of work. A wandering ascetic arrived, wanting to put a question, and Ananda turned him away 3 times, quite reasonably, because the teacher was dying. He heard it from where he lay and said to let the man in. It was the last conversation he had with a stranger, and he ordained him, and that was the final thing he did in the role. Then he asked the assembly 3 times whether anybody had a doubt or a difficulty about any of it, about him, about the teaching, about the community, about the path. Ask now, he said, so that you do not think afterwards that you were face to face with him and could not bring yourselves to speak. 3 times, and nobody said anything. He had spent 45 years refusing to say what happens at the end, and there is the last opportunity anyone will ever have with a man who has nothing left to lose and every reason to comfort the people around him, and he does not volunteer it. Whatever the silence was, it was not a strategy. It went all the way down. And then the last sentence, which is short, and which is about as far from a revelation as a final sentence can get. Everything that is put together comes apart, he said. Carry on with care. Which leaves the question that has been underneath all of this, and that he never addressed directly. If there is nobody in there, why did he bother? 45 years of walking in that heat, on those roads, into his 80s, in a body he described as a cart held together with straps, and at the center of it a doctrine which says that the one doing the walking is a process and not a somebody, and that the people he was walking towards are the same, and that none of it belonged to anyone. The nearest thing his tradition has to an answer is not a proof and has never been offered as one. It is an observation, and it goes roughly like this. People are almost never cruel because they want to be. They are cruel because they are defending something, a position, a story about themselves, a place in an order, a version that has to be kept up. Take away the thing that needs guarding, and the guarding stops, and what is underneath is not indifference. It is the opposite. The care was there the whole time, held down by the defending. I do not know whether that is true. I have watched it be true in a few people, and I have watched it fail in a great many others, myself included. What I can tell you is that it has been enough for an enormous number of people across an extremely long stretch of time, which is not evidence and is not nothing either. There is a man much closer to us who got to the same place by argument and who wrote down what it felt like. Derek Parfit spent his working life in Oxford on the question of what makes somebody the same person over time, arrived at conclusions he himself said were close to the ones in this material, and then did the thing philosophers almost never do, which is describe the effect. My life, he wrote, seemed like a glass tunnel through which I was moving faster every year, and at the end of which there was darkness. When I changed my view, the walls of my glass tunnel disappeared. I now live in the open air. There is still a difference between my life and the lives of other people, but the difference is less. Other people are closer. And about dying, he said only that it now seemed to him less bad. That is a 20th century Englishman with no religion, working from nothing but argument, reporting the same two results as the man in the sale grove, that the walls come down and that other people move closer. It does not prove the doctrine. It does suggest that whatever was found under that tree was never a private consolation available only to people prepared to believe things. So that is all of it. A boy in the shade of a tree and a young man in a doorway who did real damage on his way out, and 6 years of wrecking a body, and 45 years of walking, and a bad meal, and a grove outside a town nobody had heard of. You do not have to decide anything about him tonight. You will not remember the names, and you were never meant to. The thing he spent his life pointing at was never in the names. The room has gone quiet around you, and your breathing slowed a good while ago without any help from you. There is nothing here that needs holding up, nothing that has to be settled, nothing that will be lost if you stop attending to it now. Whatever you were carrying when this started is still on the floor beside the bed where you put it, and it will keep. Everything that is put together comes apart. That includes the day you had, and the day has already begun coming apart, and you can feel it going. Let it. There is no part of this you have to finish. Rest now. Good night.